Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. A soft glow pressed through the edges of my curtains, thin and pale, like someone had parked a car right outside and left the high beams on. I squinted at it, still half in that heavy, fuzzy sleep where everything feels slow. I checked my phone on the nightstand. It read 2:18 a.m., no notifications, no missed calls, just the time and the dull blue screen. The glow didn't pulse or move. It just stayed there, seeping in around the fabric in a way that felt wrong somehow. Too even. Too quiet. I rolled onto my back and listened. No engines, no footsteps, no voices outside, just the low hum of my fridge through the wall and the faint ticking of the old heater. After a few seconds, curiosity won out over comfort. I pushed myself up and crept over to the window, bare feet cold against the floorboards. I slid the curtain aside slowly, expecting to see a car or maybe some weirdo shining a flashlight around the yard. Instead, I saw the pale glow lifting upward. It rose straight up past the top of the window frame, soundless, smooth, like a dim orb or dome drifting into the dark. No flicker, no trail. Just a quiet retreat into the cloudy sky until the night swallowed it. The backyard looked normal again. My fence, the patch of overgrown grass, the crooked old bird bath. No source for the light anywhere. I stood there, curtain still in my hand, staring out like I'd missed something important by a second. My name's Adrian Velez. I lived alone in a rented duplex just outside Port Angeles, close enough to hear the distant waves when the wind shifted right. It had been drizzling earlier that evening, the kind of light coastal rain that left everything damp and smelling slightly metallic already, but this felt different. I cracked the window open a few inches and leaned out. Cold air rolled in, salty and wet. No fresh light, no noise. Just darkness and the soft murmur of far-off surf. I waited. Nothing else happened. Eventually, I shut the window and pulled the curtains closed. I stood there a while longer, listening for an engine start or footsteps on wet gravel, but the night stayed still. Back in bed, sleep didn't come easy. Every tiny sound made my eyes snap open. The old floor creaking in the hallway, the pipes shifting as the heater kicked on and off. I kept glancing back at the curtains, half expecting that glow to seep through again. It didn't. When I finally drifted off, it was shallow and restless. The next morning was gray and foggy, the kind of fog that smeared the outline of everything and made distance hard to judge. I convinced myself maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Half dream, half reflection of passing headlights. That happens sometimes. But when I stepped out onto the back porch to take the trash out, I noticed the grass right beneath my bedroom window looked flattened in a neat circular patch. Not trampled exactly, just gently bent, like something had pressed down evenly and then lifted away. I crouched, running my fingers over the damp blades. No footprints, no tire tracks, just that smooth, shallow depression in the grass. I shook it off and went about my day. By afternoon, I was back at my job on the docks, unloading shipments with my coworker Mateo trying not to think about it. But all day I caught myself glancing up at the low clouds, scanning for anything out of place. Nothing appeared. That evening, I mentioned it casually to my neighbor Denise while we both checked our mail. "You ever see weird lights around here at night?" I asked, trying to sound normal. She laughed softly. "Only the usual drunk tourists and their flashlights." "Why?" "Just thought I saw something last night. Probably a reflection." She shrugged and shuffled back inside, not concerned at all. The next few nights passed quietly, enough to lull me even more into thinking it had been a fluke. But then, 3 days later, it happened again. This time, I wasn't asleep. I'd been lying on the couch watching a rerun with the volume low when the living room slowly filled with that same pale light. It crept across the carpet and up the walls like fog made of glow. I muted the TV and sat up straight. The glow wasn't harsh. It wasn't warm either, just steady and dim enough to notice. I approached the sliding glass door that looked out to the backyard. Outside, floating just above the fence line, a rounded haze of light hung completely still. No shape I could clearly define, but not just mist either. It held its form in an unnatural way, like it had edges that my eyes refused to focus on. My throat tightened. I stood there frozen, hand hovering over the door handle, unsure whether opening it was the worst decision or the only way to prove I wasn't losing it. The glow slid sideways, slow and deliberate, tracing along the top of the fence before drifting upward again into the fog, dissolving without a sound. The backyard returned to darkness. I looked at my phone again. 11:36 p.m. This time, the signal bars flickered and dropped to zero before settling back. A chill crept along my arms. The air felt heavier for a moment, pressed flat and still. Even the distant ocean noise seemed to fade. I didn't open the door, I just stood there until my legs started shaking. That night, I double-checked every lock, every latch, every window. When I finally crawled into bed, I left the curtains slightly open, eyes fixed on the glass, replaying that silent upward drift over and over. Sometime after midnight, I heard a faint vibration through the floor, almost like a large truck passing, except there was no rumble to go with it. Just enough motion to make the water in the bedside glass ripple slightly. Then it stopped. No glow this time, no light, just subtle silence again. I stayed awake for hours, staring, listening, trying to piece together what kind of normal thing could cause all of this. Morning came slow and colorless. The fog clung to the edges of everything. I stepped outside again and noticed the same subtle flattening in the grass, extended farther this time, wider, almost like an impression from something round, but too light to leave actual marks. I felt embarrassed even thinking of it, but I still took a photo on my phone. When I checked the image later, the patch looked less defined than I remembered, just slightly darker grass. The following night, I didn't see the glow, but I smelled it instead. That cold metallic scent drifted faintly through my bedroom, sharp and clean, nothing like damp soil or ocean air. It lingered for a minute, then vanished as if someone had shut a door on it. I sat up, heart hammering, listening for movement outside. Nothing came. By the end of the week, I started wondering if the house itself felt different, like some part of my space was being observed quietly, without urgency, just a presence that arrived, hovered, and left. Then one night, it returned for the last time. I lay in bed with my eyes half closed when the pale glow pushed through the edges of my curtains again. Soft, steady, familiar in a way that made my pulse race. I slid the curtains open. The light hovered higher this time, just beyond the roofline, casting a faint sheen over the wet shingles and fence. Then slowly it lifted, as if responding to nothing but its own quiet timing, and drifted into the cloud cover above. The sky sealed behind it. The street stayed empty. No voices, no engines, just the distant hush of the ocean and the soft creak of my old house settling. I closed the curtains and stood there a long time, letting my eyes adjust back to darkness, trying to make any kind of sense of it all. Nothing else happened after that. No more pressing glow, no humming, no strange patches in the yard. But some nights, when the fog hung low and the curtains stirred slightly in the breeze, I still found myself staring at the window, waiting for that soft, shapeless light to quietly slide upward again. My headlights washed over something smooth and pale hovering just above the center of the road like a low floating pane of glass, and for half a second, my brain refused to label it as anything real. It didn't look like fog or dust or a puddle catching light. It looked solid, reflective, perfectly even. As soon as I hit the brakes and leaned forward, it disappeared, leaving only empty asphalt and a faint metallic smell drifting through my open window. I was driving south through the Flint Hills outside Council Grove, the kind of stretch where the road dipped and curved between dark grass ridges and patches of scrubby trees. It was close to midnight, heavy summer air, no wind. I'd taken that route 100 times after visiting my cousin Marco, and there was never anything out there except deer and the occasional farm truck. I slowed almost to a stop, heart thudding, scanning the road like I expected the thing to snap back into place. Nothing. Just blacktop and the weak white glow of my own beams. The smell stuck around though, cold and sharp, like I'd rubbed a coin between my fingers. I told myself it was just glare from a road sign or heat shimmer playing tricks, but the road signs were a mile back, and the night wasn't hot enough for that kind of distortion. The longer I sat there, the quieter everything felt. Crickets that had been chirping through the fields a second ago went silent. Even the faint wind I hadn't really noticed before felt like it had stalled. I eased the car forward again. The smell followed a little, then slowly faded. My mirrors showed nothing behind me, just my own tail lights reflecting off distant grass. A few minutes later, the radio crackled. Not static exactly, more like the sound of a tuning dial being brushed slowly. I hadn't changed channels. It had been playing low local ads before that, and now it was just a soft, uneven hiss. I tapped the dashboard and turned the knob, but it didn't clear. It just got quieter until the speakers went dead. That metallic scent returned in a thin thread through the stale air. I rolled my window up a little, like that would explain anything, and kept driving, trying to focus on the white lines undulating ahead of me. That's when I noticed the clock on the dash looked off. I could have sworn when I left Marco's place it was 10:52. Now it read 11:41, and I hadn't been on the road nearly that long. I glanced down at my phone in the cup holder. No signal. Not even one bar. Just that hollow, no service message glowing on black. That never happened out there unless you went way farther south. The road curved left and dropped into a low valley. As I came down the slope, my headlights caught it again. The surface hovered in the middle of the lane about 10 feet ahead. Larger this time. Smooth. Almost pearly. It reflected my lights clearly, like a faint mirror, but it didn't shine back. Just swallowed the beams like they were sliding off wet stone. No way to judge depth. It felt like looking at something that wasn't supposed to occupy space. I slowed with trembling hands, foot barely touching the brake. The closer I got, the more that metallic scent sharpened, cold and sterile. When I was about 30 feet from it, it drifted sideways. Not forward or back, just slid slowly to the right toward the tall grass, still suspended, perfectly level. Then it faded, like someone lowering the opacity of a film until it was gone. The fields swallowed the darkness whole. I sat there with my car idling, throat dry, trying to process what I'd just watched move away like a thought changing its mind. A low hum crept up through the floorboards. Not loud, more vibration than sound. The steering wheel trembled faintly under my palms. My side mirrors quivered just slightly. The hum deepened for a second, then flattened out into silence. A cloud passed over the moon, and the road fell even darker. I swallowed and pressed the gas. The car rolled forward, tires whispering over asphalt. I didn't look to the sides anymore. I just focused on staying steadily between the lines, as if veering even an inch might trigger whatever that thing had been to come back. Every so often I caught flickers in the corner of my eye, like pale reflections far out in the grass, moving parallel to the road. When I tried to focus on them, they vanished. My phone buzzed suddenly on the console. No vibration sound, just the screen lighting up. It was a text from my sister Lila, timestamped 10 minutes earlier. "You okay? You left kinda weird." I stared at it, confused. I hadn't told her I was leaving that late. I typed back, "Yeah, just driving home. Why?" The message sat unsent. "Still trying," blinked beneath it. No signal. The smell of metal crept back again, faint but steady, like it had soaked into the fabric of the night. Another mile down the road, the reflectors along the edge all flashed brighter at once, lining the asphalt with a pale, unnatural glow. Ahead, the same smooth, reflective surface hovered again, lower this time, nearly grazing the top of the road itself. It didn't move as I approached, it just waited, silent and even, occupying space like it belonged there more than the night did. I slowed to a crawl. My breaths came shallow. The inside of the car felt too small. The hum returned, stronger now. The air around me pressed inward, thick and heavy. The headlights bent slightly against the surface, like light folding rather than landing. Then, a few feet before I would have touched it, the surface lifted gently, almost lazily, and drifted upward into the dark sky. It didn't rush, it didn't dart. It ascended straight and steady until my lights couldn't reach it, until even the faint reflection vanished into black. Everything fell quiet again, no humming, no vibration, just the engine idling and my own breathing. The metallic smell thinned, then disappeared completely. I sat there longer than I meant to, hands still clenched on the wheel, eyes fixed on the empty spot where it had been. The sky looked normal, no stars blocked, no shapes moving, no sign of anything strange. Eventually, I forced myself to drive on. The rest of the trip passed in uneasy silence. The radio stayed dead. My phone kept searching for signal. A thin layer of sweat clung to the back of my neck, even though the air had cooled. When I finally pulled into my driveway, my porch light flickered once and steadied. The house looked exactly how I'd left it, quiet, still. As I stepped out of the car, the faintest trace of that metallic scent lingered around the hood, then vanished like breath in cold air. Inside, the clock read 12:06 a.m. My phone pinged finally as signal returned. 3 new texts from Lila, the oldest one timestamped from almost an hour earlier. You left in the middle of the story. Everything good, Eli? I stood there in the quiet kitchen, trying to line it all up in my head, trying to find the moment where time slipped, or the road bent, or that surface appeared. Outside, far off across the fields, something caught the moonlight briefly. A small pale shimmer, then darkness again. I didn't go to the window. A low droning sound rolled over my roof, steady and deep, like a giant appliance running just out of sight. It wasn't loud enough to rattle anything, but it was heavy, like pressure on the air. I lay there for a second, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out if it was a helicopter, some kind of truck, or just something in my own head. I checked the clock on my nightstand, 5:12 a.m. The sky outside was still dark blue, but light was starting to leak into the edges of the curtains. Early morning haze hung over the neighborhood, the kind that made everything feel muted and far away. The droning kept going, unbroken. No rise or fall, no change in pitch. Just a flat, constant hum like it had no engine or rhythm behind it. I swung my legs out of bed and crossed to the window. When I pushed the curtains aside, nothing looked out of place. The street was empty. No headlights, no flashing lights, no movement. But the sound stayed, hovering somewhere above the house. Then it stopped, so clean and sudden that it felt like someone had hit a switch. Right after the silence, every bird around my yard burst into noise all at once. Crows, sparrows, whatever else lived in the trees behind the houses. It was chaotic and sharp, like they'd been frozen and released. My skin broke out in goosebumps. I stood there, hands on the window frame, trying to understand the timing of it. The world felt too alert, like everything had jumped at the same moment. My name's Callum Price. I'd moved to the outskirts of Red Bluff about 6 months earlier for a job inspecting irrigation systems. Quiet place. Flat land, dry heat, lots of open space, and low trees. Most mornings were just wind and the occasional tractor miles down the road. I stepped outside barefoot, the porch boards cool and slightly damp from overnight dew. The sky had that pale washed look, like light was being strained through thin clouds. I looked straight up, squinting, but there was nothing. No aircraft, no blinking lights, no shadow passing over the roof. Just empty sky. The birds eventually settled back into their scattered calls. I stood there a while longer, waiting for the droning to come back, listening for any hint of movement. Nothing did. I went back inside, made coffee, tried to convince myself it had been some distant plane or heavy equipment warming up somewhere. But even as the day went on, that flat hum stuck in my head like a memory of pressure. Around noon, I mentioned it to my coworker Diego while we drove out to check a pump system near the North Fields. "You hear a big drone this morning?" I asked. He frowned. "Not really, just crickets." "Why?" "Sounded like something hanging over my house for almost a minute." He shrugged. "Probably a military chopper or something. They test all kinds of stuff out here. Except it hadn't moved. It hadn't sounded mechanical. It hadn't felt normal. That night, the air stayed warm even after sunset. A dry breeze pushed through the open windows, carrying the smell of dust and cut grass. I lay on the couch with the TV on low when the faint hum returned. This time it was softer, like it was farther away, but unmistakably the same. A smooth vibration that didn't echo, that didn't bounce, didn't interfere with anything else. I muted the TV and listened. The sound seemed to hover somewhere just above the roofline again, steady and wrong. My heart climbed into my throat. I stepped outside slowly, testing each footfall as if the air itself might react. The sky was dark now, no stars visible through the thin streaks of cloud. The sound continued, filling the space above me but giving no direction, no source. Then again, it stopped. And again, the silence cracked open with a sudden rush of bird calls. Even the ones that should have been asleep shrieked and fluttered, wings beating against leaves and fences. It felt rehearsed, timed, too precise. I stood in the middle of the yard, every muscle tight, staring upward. A faint chill crept along my arms despite the warmth. After a few moments, everything settled. The night returned to its usual quiet, but the calm felt thin after that, like a surface stretched too tight. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated in small ways. Not always the same hour, but around dawn or just after nightfall. The droning would appear without warning, last close to a minute, then stop. And every time it did, the birds erupted as one. By the fourth time, I noticed something else. During the hum, the air felt heavier, like walking into invisible humidity. The wind stilled completely. Even the leaves froze in place, like the world paused while that sound hovered above. I started keeping the porch light on, even during the day sometimes, just to feel less exposed. One evening, right as the light was fading, I stood on the porch waiting for it, watching the sky, listening for the first hint of vibration. It arrived softer than before, like it was being filtered through a layer of thick air. My ears felt slightly full, like when you shift altitude too fast. I whispered, "What is that?" out loud, even though no one was there. The low hum wrapped around the house for nearly a full minute, then cut off again like a cord had been pulled. Every bird responded instantly, frantic and sharp, breaking the silence with a sound that felt too alive compared to everything else. When I looked up this time, I thought I saw a faint distortion in the clouds, a subtle circular break where the sky looked darker than the rest. It wasn't a clear shape, more like the suggestion of something occupying space. Then it faded. I didn't sleep much that night. Every small sound felt magnified. Every shift in the house made my breath tighten. The following morning, I walked the yard out of habit, checking for anything unusual. Near the edge of the grass closest to the open field, the ground looked slightly pressed down in a smooth arc. No footprints, just flat and dry soil like something had hovered or settled briefly without touching hard. I crouched, touching it. The dirt was warmer than the surrounding ground. A slow unease settled into my chest. That night, right before midnight, the droning returned for the longest stretch yet. A full minute and a half, maybe more. My walls seemed to buzz faintly under it. The cups in my kitchen gave a tiny rattle against each other. I stepped outside again, pulse pounding. The sound felt centered over the house, like the roof sat directly under whatever caused it. I searched the sky, but the clouds offered nothing but darkness. When it finally cut off, the birds exploded into noise so loudly it startled me back a step. Wings flapped, twigs snapped, leaves rustled wildly. Then it all fell quiet again. The rest of the night passed without another incident, but the air felt slightly different afterward. Not colder, just watched. In the days that followed, the droning didn't return. The birds went back to their normal patterns. The yard looked ordinary again, but every evening, when the sky dimmed and the wind fell still, I caught myself listening for that flat, heavy hum, for that unnatural pause before every living thing burst into sudden sound. And sometimes, when the night stayed too quiet for too long, I stood on the porch and searched the dark above my roof, wondering if it was just waiting for the right moment to come back. A tight cluster of stars over the eastern ridge started flickering so fast it looked like someone messing with a light dimmer. The sky around them stayed normal, steady and quiet, just that small patch pulsing strangely, then going completely dark for a few seconds. When the stars blinked back into place, one of them was gone. I stood there with my coffee half raised, staring up like my eyes had glitched instead of the sky. This happened on a cold, clear night in mid-October up on the old gravel pullout off Bear Creek Road. I'd driven up there because I couldn't sleep and the air in my cabin felt too still. The mountains south of Missoula got real quiet at night, especially once the early snow started dusting the higher peaks. My name's Rowan Decker. I rented a little one-room cabin about 20 minutes outside town while doing contract forestry survey work. Most evenings, I sat on the hood of my truck and watched the stars until I got tired enough to pass out. That night, the air was sharp and dry. No clouds, no wind, perfect visibility. The kind where the whole sky looked close enough to touch. After the flicker stopped and that single star didn't return, I kept scanning the same spot, trying to convince myself I just miscounted or moved my head slightly. But I knew that cluster. I used it to spot Cassiopeia most nights. I pulled my phone out and opened the compass app, pointed it up, double-checked, Where I stood. Still the same patch. The night stayed silent, no hum, no breeze, just the faint scrap of dry grass moving slightly downhill. I told myself to relax and took a sip of coffee. Bitter, already cooling. When I lowered the mug, the same cluster flickered again, even faster this time, like static sparking across a screen. Then it happened. The stars dimmed altogether and went out completely. Not the whole sky, just that small, perfect section, like a hole punched through the night. The darkness looked deeper there, thicker somehow. I held my breath without realizing it. After maybe 3 seconds, the lights returned, but it wasn't identical. One point was missing. The shape of the cluster was slightly uneven now, like a tooth gap. I whispered, "That's not right," even though no one stood near enough to hear. A slow unease crept down my shoulders. I scanned the rest of the sky, half expecting something to drift across or flare up, but everything else stayed normal. The moon sat low and thin over the pines. No planes, no satellites. I waited. 5 minutes passed. Nothing changed. I climbed back into the truck and sat there with the engine off, just watching through the windshield. I kept replaying the flicker in my head, trying to make logical sense of it. Satellites don't behave like that. Meteors don't blink in place. The night grew colder. My breath fogged faintly. Then I noticed something else. The birds, which usually made occasional rustling sounds in the trees, even at night, stayed absolutely silent. No wings, no chirping. Even the crickets that usually stubbornly carried on this late in the season had gone quiet. It felt staged. I stayed longer than I meant to, long enough for the inside of my truck to feel like a freezer. When nothing else happened, I drove back down the gravel road, tires crunching through loose stone. As I pulled into my little dirt driveway, I glanced up again out of habit. The star was still missing. The next evening, the sky stayed overcast until around 9. When it finally cleared, I stepped back outside, hoping in some weird way that the missing point of light would be back in its place. It wasn't. The rest of the stars glittered like normal. That one gap stayed, faint but noticeable now that I knew where to look. I kept watching. Half an hour passed. Then the cluster flickered again, slower this time, like blinking eyes. The pulse spread slightly wider, affecting more stars around it. My heart started to pound. The lights went out a third time, the dark patch perfectly circular. When they came back, the missing star still didn't return. Instead, I thought I saw a very faint, dull glow drifting just beneath that darkened space, almost like something soft moving through ink. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, looked again. The glow drifted sideways and then faded. No sound followed. No rush of wind, no vibration underfoot. Just the awareness that the sky had behaved in a way it wasn't supposed to. Over the next few nights, subtle changes kept happening. One evening, the stars above my cabin looked slightly smeared in that same section, like a barely visible blur moving back and forth. Another night, the air felt heavier whenever I stood directly under that patch of sky, like invisible humidity pressing down. I started sleeping with the curtains closed. Not because I thought something would look in, just because the sky felt wrong. On the fourth night, I woke around 2:30 a.m. for no clear reason. The cabin was pitch black, dead quiet. I sat up and felt an odd pull to check outside, like a habit I hadn't chosen. I slid the door open and stepped out barefoot onto the wooden boards. The air bit straight into my skin. My breath showed instantly. The cluster of stars flickered again, more violently than before. The whole group pulsated like a heartbeat, then dropped out entirely, leaving that unnatural void. But this time, something moved through it. Not a shape I could clearly follow. More like the suggestion of movement, like watching a faint silhouette pass behind frosted glass. Slow and deliberate. I froze where I stood. The darkness lifted a second later, and the stars snapped back on, except now 2 were missing. The form was gone. The sky returned to normal, like it hadn't just shifted in front of me. I stepped back inside, closing the door without looking away from the window. My hands trembled. Not violently, just enough to feel off balance. Sleep didn't come easily after that. Morning found everything exactly as it should have been. Frost on the grass, distant highway traffic hum, coffee brewing like always. I tried to rationalize it. Atmospheric lensing, visual distortions, my own tired eyes. But deep down, it felt personal, like whatever was happening up there was noticing the ground below it. That night, I drove back to the pullout on Bear Creek Road just to confirm I wasn't imagining any of it. The truck headlights cut across the slope. Wind hissed faintly through dry weeds. The cluster was dimmer than usual now, as if the entire area had lost energy. The missing stars created a subtle asymmetry I couldn't ignore. I waited. After several minutes, the flicker returned, more erratic now. The stars cut out again, and in that perfect pocket of darkness, a faint horizontal line appeared. Pale and thin, like charcoal, dragged softly across invisible paper. It shifted slightly, then vanished. The stars returned. A low, uncomfortable awareness settled over my chest, like being watched from above, but not in a way eyes would work. I left soon after, not rushing, but definitely not hanging around either. Weeks passed, and the nights eventually returned to their regular rhythm. The cluster stayed altered. The missing stars never reappeared. No one else I asked seemed to notice anything strange. My coworker Lacey shrugged when I mentioned it. "Sky always looks different when you stare too long," she said. Maybe, but I stopped looking for that section as often. Still, sometimes when I couldn't sleep and stepped outside, I caught myself glancing up at that familiar spot. It never flickered again the way it had before, but the stars always felt a little farther away after that. The second the pump clicked on, it started making a low, even hum that didn't sound like the usual chugging whir. It was smoother, almost like it was coming from deep under the concrete instead of the nozzle. I glanced over and noticed the pump beside me was doing the same thing, and then the one on the far end too. All of them vibrated faintly, humming together like they'd synced up. I looked around the station, half expecting someone to explain it or laugh about it. The lot was almost empty. One dusty pickup by the air compressor and a sedan parked crooked near the door, but no one outside. The little convenience store glowed dull orange, the buzz of cheap fluorescent lights flickering behind the windows. This was a small place just off Route 48, out past Pecos Junction in southern New Mexico. Flat land, scrubby brush, nothing open for miles except this station and a diner about half a mile down. It was close to midnight and still warm, that dry desert heat that never really went away. My name is Darren Holt. I'd been driving back from my cousin Reese's place in Las Cruces after helping him move some furniture. I'd left later than planned because we kept getting sidetracked, talking about nothing. By the time I hit this stretch of road, my gas light had been on long enough to make me nervous. As the tank filled, the hum grew a little louder, like it was building up instead of tapering off. I put my hand against the metal body of the pump and felt a steady vibration running through it. Not violent, just enough to feel wrong. Then I noticed the sky. Above the station canopy, a pale white glow drifted slowly from west to east, just high enough to clear the roof. It didn't pulse or flare. It just moved, steady and silent, like it was gliding. At first I thought it was a plane, but there was no blinking, no sound, no shape. Just light, soft, and round-edged, moving too slow to make sense. I stepped back from the pump, the nozzle still in my tank, and tilted my head to follow it. The glow passed directly overhead and softened further, like it was being swallowed by the night sky. The pumps kept humming, every single one of them. The light drifted another few yards and then faded out entirely, leaving the darkness exactly as it had been before. No streak, no afterimage. The humming didn't stop. I turned in a slow circle, watching the edges of the sky, my palms damp despite the dry air. My breathing sounded too loud in my own ears. "Hello?" I called out, not even sure who I was talking to. No response. I walked over to the store door and glanced inside. The cashier, a guy in his late 40s with thinning hair and heavy eyelids, was leaning on the counter, staring down at his phone. He didn't look surprised or confused. Just bored. I pushed the door open and the bell chimed. "You hear that?" I asked, nodding toward the pumps. He barely looked up. "Hear what?" "The pumps. They sound different." He tilted his head, listened for about half a second, then shrugged. "They always do that sometimes." "All at once, though?" "Old wiring," he said, already turning back to his screen. I walked back outside, feeling weirdly exposed under the open sky. The pumps continued their steady hum, now almost like background noise, but it set my teeth on edge. A minute later, the humming dropped back into normal mechanical clunks as the pump reached full. The sudden silence felt just as strange as the sound had been. I hung up the nozzle and stood there a moment longer, staring at the empty sky where the light had passed. Nothing moved. I climbed into my car and sat with the door shut, hands resting on the steering wheel. The air inside smelled faintly metallic, sharper than the usual gas station stink. It reminded me of cold coins and old batteries. I tried to brush it off and started the engine. As I pulled out onto the highway, the memory of that pale glow stuck with me. It hadn't been dramatic or fast. It was calm, almost deliberate. I made it home just after 1 in the morning, parked in front of my small duplex on the edge of town. The porch light flickered when I stepped onto the concrete, dimming slightly, then returning to normal brightness. Inside, everything seemed the same. The fan hummed, the fridge kicked on. My dog, Milo, lifted his head from his bed and watched me with sleepy eyes. I fed him and tried to settle down, but the quiet felt heavier than usual. I found myself checking the windows more often, glancing at the dark between houses. Sometime past 3, I woke up without knowing why. The room felt warmer, like the air had thickened. I sat up and listened. Outside, faint mechanical humming drifted through the stillness. Not loud, just enough to notice. Steady and low, like the pumps had sounded. Milo stayed curled in his bed, but his ears twitched, his eyes now open and staring toward the front door. I walked slowly over and cracked it open. The street outside was empty, washed in pale overhead lights, and up above the neighboring rooftops, there it was again. A soft white glow, lingering this time, hovering just above the power lines. It wasn't drifting. It was almost still, like it had decided to wait there. I held my breath, barely moving. The glow shifted slightly, not rising or falling, just sliding a few inches sideways. Then it made a slow, smooth climb, lifting into the sky without a sound, fading as it rose until it became part of the darkness. The humming stopped. I stood there for what felt like forever afterward, staring into nothing, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But the air still smelled faintly metallic. Milo refused to come closer to the door. Over the next few days, little strange details kept happening. The porch light dimmed randomly. My phone battery drained faster than usual. Once, while washing dishes, I thought I saw a faint reflection slide across the window behind me. But when I turned, nothing was there. I didn't talk about it with anyone besides Reese, and even then I kept it light. Probably just weird lights from the highway, I told him. He laughed and said I needed better coffee. Maybe he was right. But every time I passed that same gas station after dark, the memory of those pumps humming together and that pale light drifting across the canopy crept back into my thoughts. And sometimes, late at night, when the town went perfectly still, I swore I could hear a faint hum in the distance. Not mechanical, not quite natural either. When it happened, I always checked the sky. I woke up because the room felt colder than it should have, even though the heat had been running all night. My first thought was that a window was cracked open, so I rolled over and looked toward the bedroom window. That's when I saw the condensation. It wasn't the usual fog you get when the weather shifts. It was thick and dragged downward in long streaks, like something had pressed along the glass and left trails behind. The lines were uneven, stretched almost from the top of the window to the bottom, wider in some places and thin in others, as if whatever caused them had leaned in close. I sat up slowly and stared at it, trying to process what I was seeing. The glass itself felt cold when I touched it, but the air inside the room was dry. Outside, the night was still dark and quiet, the streetlight across from my house casting a dull orange patch over my lawn. My name is Colin Mercer. I lived alone in a small rental on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, Iowa. It wasn't a creepy place, just a simple one-story house with thin walls and creaky floors. I'd lived there a little over a year, and nothing like this had ever happened. I pulled the curtain back completely and leaned closer. The streaks were clearer now, like greasy fingerprints smeared vertically, but larger, spaced several inches apart. I couldn't figure out how anything could have done that from the outside without leaving marks on the sill or frame. I opened the window a couple inches and stuck my head out. The air smelled damp, like rain had passed earlier, but the yard was empty. No footprints, no disturbed grass, just the soft hum of insects and the distant roll of a car on the highway. I shut the window again and wiped at the glass with my sleeve. The streaks didn't disappear right away, they smeared further before finally thinning out. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. I checked the rest of the house after that. Living room, kitchen, back hallway. Everything looked normal. The back door was locked. The porch light still worked. My phone said it was 3:18 a.m. I tried going back to sleep, but my mind wouldn't settle. Every small sound felt louder. The fridge clicking on, the pipes shifting. I kept imagining slow pressure on the window again, something outside I couldn't see. Eventually, close to 5, the sky lightened enough that I drifted off. When I woke up properly later that morning, the window looked normal. No streaks, no fog, just clear glass. I told myself it was just weird humidity. Maybe my breath had somehow caused it while I slept. But the shape of those lines didn't make sense for that. Later that afternoon, my neighbor Bryce stopped by while I was taking trash out. He lived 2 houses down, mid-30s, always friendly in a half-awake kind of way. "Everything good?" he asked, leaning on his own bin. "Yeah," I said, pausing. "Hey, did you notice anything weird outside last night? Like someone around the street or anything?" He shook his head. "Nah, slept like a rock. Why?" "Nothing," I said, forcing a casual smile. "Just thought I heard something." That night, I left my bedroom blinds slightly open, more out of nerves than curiosity. The sky was clear, moon faint, a few stars visible above the tree line. I kept the lamp off and lay there, watching. Around midnight, I noticed the air felt heavier again. Not colder this time, just off. Then faintly came a low vibration, more felt than heard. It reminded me of a truck idling far away. I sat up, listening. The vibration came in gentle waves, almost like pressure moving through the air. My chest tightened without me realizing. Slowly, the window began to fog from the outside in, this time spreading in a thin sheet. Then the streaks reappeared, long lines like before, forming from top to bottom. Only this time they pressed harder, deeper, as if there was weight behind them. I held my breath. There was no shape, no hand, just the impression of something pressed close enough to leave those marks. I forced myself to stand and step toward the window. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I reached out and placed my palm against the glass, right beside one of the streaks. The glass was cold. The streak itself was warmer. My fingers lingered there, and the streak slowly faded as if whatever caused it had pulled back. The vibration outside lessened. Then everything went still. I opened the curtain wider and reached for the latch, stopping halfway. A part of me didn't want to know what I'd see. Still, I slid the window open just enough to peer out. Again, nothing. The yard looked the same. Shadows pooled along the fence line. The trees barely moved. But up beyond the house across the street, hovering low above their roof, there was a faint glow. Barely white like diluted moonlight, but steady. It didn't blink. It didn't move with the breeze. I stared at it, frozen. The glow seemed to drift slightly upward, then just dissolve. No trail, no fade. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't. The window continued to fog lightly, though the streaks no longer formed. I closed the glass and backed away, feeling like the air inside the room no longer belonged to me. It felt borrowed, altered. I slept a little after that, though my dreams were scattered and heavy. Over the following week, smaller things kept happening. My phone would lose signal for a few seconds at odd hours. The radio in my car would click through static even when turned off. Once I found new streaks on the bathroom mirror that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. I didn't tell anyone. Saying it out loud felt too exposed. Every night I checked that window. Some nights it stayed clear, others it fogged slightly but without the streaks. And then one morning I woke to find the condensation back again, heavier than before, forming not just lines but faint curved impressions, like the edges of something larger pressing gently, quietly against the outside glass. When I touched the streak, it was warm. There were no sounds outside, no movement, just the distant hush of a normal day starting. I wiped the glass slowly, feeling my own reflection shift beneath my hand, and wondered how long it had been standing there before I opened my eyes. My watch buzzed once, and the screen went blank halfway through the jog, like it had just given up. I glanced down as I kept moving, expecting it to come back on, but it stayed frozen on 2.73 miles and a heart rate that didn't change at all. That wasn't normal. The thing never did that. I slowed to a walk but didn't remember deciding to slow down. In my head, I was still running, still counting breaths, still thinking about the podcast I'd put on. Only the sound was gone too. The earbuds were in, but silence filled them, like they'd turned off without telling me. I stopped completely and looked around. The trail ahead didn't look right. I'd run this loop at least 4 times a week for almost a year. It was the Pine Crest Trail just outside Bend, Oregon, looping behind an old campground and back toward a shallow creek. I knew every dip, every cracked root, every weird bend where the trees leaned too far in. But what I saw in front of me wasn't that. The dirt path stretched forward, narrower than I remembered, and curved slightly left into a pocket of thicker trees. The air felt damp and heavier than it should for early summer. A low fog clung to the ground just enough to smudge the view past 20 feet. I spun around confused, expecting to see the familiar clearing behind me. Instead, the trees looked the same in every direction. No obvious landmark, no sun breaking through, just pale gray morning light and silence. My name is Evan Holloway. I was 32 at the time, lived alone in a duplex on the north side of town. I worked remote doing CAD drafting for a small firm out of Boise. The trail was my thing, the only part of my day that stayed predictable. This didn't feel like that. I checked my watch again. It still read 2.73 miles. Time said 6:09 a.m. I'd started at 5:38. That meant I'd lost over half an hour without knowing it. I scrolled through the activity log. It flatlined around the same time. No steps, no heart changes, nothing recorded afterward. I stood there a second longer, trying to calm myself down. Memory felt slippery, like a dream fading fast. I couldn't remember passing the old wooden sign or the slight incline near the creek, which should have been coming up. I decided the safest move was to keep walking forward. Standing still felt worse. As I moved, the fog seemed to thin and thicken in waves, not naturally, more like patches breathing. The air had a faint metallic smell, like rain on hot pavement, except it hadn't rained. A soft clicking noise drifted through the trees, not regular enough to be a bird, not loud enough to place. It came and went like it was circling, though I couldn't see anything. I called out, half hoping another jogger would respond. No one did. Another few minutes passed and the trail started to slope downward slightly. My legs felt heavier, like they'd just finished a long push, even though I didn't remember pushing at all. Off to my left, beyond the tree line, was a glow. Very faint, almost like sunlight reflecting off something wet, but the light inside the trees didn't match it. This glow was steadier, muted, not warm. I stopped again, pulse rising, and stared. The glow slid sideways, not quickly, just smooth and slow, like a suspended reflection. No sound, no wind shift. It passed behind another set of trees and vanished. My earbuds suddenly popped alive, cutting back into the middle of the podcast like nothing had happened. So, anyway, that's why mulch doesn't decompose the same in cooler conditions. I tore them out and held them in my hand, staring at the silent path in front of me. A few minutes after that, the woods began looking more familiar. The crooked pine with a split trunk, the rock that always tripped me up if I wasn't careful, the bend that led out toward the creek. Relief hit me all at once, but the confusion didn't fade. When I checked my watch again, the time read 6:41 a.m. The run had restarted on its own, but the graph had a clean gap where those minutes had been, like they never existed. I jogged the rest of the way back in a haze, keeping my eyes locked forward, ears tuned for anything out of place. By the time I reached the trailhead, the fog had lifted to a normal morning haze. A couple of hikers waved. Everything felt ordinary again, but too neat now, too settled. At home, I sat on the edge of my couch and scrolled through the map on my watch. The GPS line didn't show a detour. No wrong turn, no deviation at all. It simply stopped, then resumed on the same path. I spent the rest of the day half distracted, jumping at small sounds, replaying the pieces I couldn't remember. That night, the sleep I got wasn't real rest. I kept seeing the pale light between the trees, that steady sideways movement. The next morning, I woke up early and checked my watch again. Full battery. No errors, no sign anything had happened. I told myself I wouldn't go back out there, that I'd take a break. Maybe stick to the gym for a while. 3 days passed before I tried again. This time I went in the late afternoon. Clear skies, warmer air, dry ground. Everything normal. I stayed hyper-aware, eyes scanning everything, footsteps steady. Nothing strange happened for the first 20 minutes. No lights, no clicking. Then the air shifted again. Same heaviness, same faint metallic tang. My smartwatch buzzed softly but didn't go dark. Instead, the screen flickered, brightened, then returned to normal. I slowed and looked around instinctively. Maybe 30 feet ahead, tucked just off the trail, something reflected the light wrong. Not shining, not glowing, just dull and smooth, like a curved surface catching the wrong angle of sun. It didn't move. It didn't shimmer. It just existed. I didn't step closer. Instead, I reversed direction slowly, keeping my eyes locked on it until it slipped behind the trees. When I got home, my watch had recorded the entire jog this time. Except again, there was a small, flat stretch in the data, just a minute long, where motion dropped to 0, even though I remembered never stopping. I showered, sat on my bed, and checked outside through the window. Everything looked normal. No fog. No glow. But the metallic smell lingered faintly in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the trail hadn't changed at all. Something else had. The glow started low, barely noticeable at first, like someone flicked on a weak light behind the far end of the skyline. I was sitting on my tiny third-floor balcony in Tacoma, just killing time after a long shift. My name is Curtis Molina, and at that point the day had already felt stretched thin. It was late evening, warm but sticky. The kind of summer air that clung to your skin even after the sun dipped down. I leaned back in the cheap plastic chair and watched the glow creep upward from behind a blocky office building about 2 streets over. It moved slow and steady, not like headlights or a plane. It had no trail, no flicker, just a dull, even light, almost like fog lit from the inside. Then it stopped, right there, mid-air, hovering between the rooftops and the clouds. No sound, no movement. It just hung there for a second too long, and then it thinned out, like it evaporated, and disappeared. I stayed frozen, beer halfway to my mouth, trying to figure out what I'd just seen. The sky went back to normal, a deep fading blue with the usual distant city glow near the horizon. I told myself it was probably just some weird reflection or construction lighting, but I didn't feel convinced. Over the next few nights, I kept finding excuses to sit out there. Same chair, same balcony rail, same view. Nothing weird happened at first. Just the normal sounds of traffic, someone's dog barking 2 buildings over, a couple arguing somewhere down the block. Then 3 nights later, the power briefly dimmed in my apartment. Not fully out, just low enough that the overhead light in the living room flickered and came back softer than before. My phone charger blinked once, then stayed on. I stepped outside and the glow came back. Same spot, same slow rise, same spot midair. This time it lingered for longer, maybe 5 or 6 seconds, then drifted slightly to the right before fading again. No sirens, no reaction from any neighbors, no voices, just quiet, like the whole section of air was holding its breath. The next day at work, I mentioned it casually to my coworker Janelle. Just a quick, "Hey, did you notice weird lights last night?" She shrugged and said she hadn't seen anything. I laughed it off and dropped it. But that night, a new sound started. Around 11:40 p.m., while I was scrolling through my phone, a low humming came from outside. Soft, steady, not mechanical like an AC unit or a fan. It felt closer, too, like it was right above me, but not loud enough to echo. I stepped out again. No glow. But the hum stayed for almost a minute before tapering off slowly, like something gliding away. I slept badly after that. Light sleep, broken dreams, the kind where you feel watched even when you're alone. 2 nights after that, I noticed a new detail. The glow returned, but this time it wasn't alone. Faint shadows bent strangely around it, like the light was shaping the air instead of passing through it. It didn't cast normal reflections on windows or glass, just absorbed into the dark sky above. It rose, paused, then sank slightly like someone testing it, before sliding back down behind the same building where it first appeared. I walked out to the edge of the balcony and leaned forward, trying to see if anything moved on the rooftop below. Nothing. No people. No antennae. Nothing that could explain it. Another few nights passed. The glow came and went. Sometimes higher, sometimes barely peeking over the roofline. No pattern I could figure out. Then something off happened inside. I was sitting in the living room when I noticed my digital clock on this flash the wrong time. It said 2:17 a.m., but my phone read 1:59. A few moments later, the stove clock corrected itself without any buttons pressed. The air smelled faintly sharp, almost like burnt metal, but there was no smoke, no burning wires, nothing obvious. I walked into the bedroom and realized the curtains were moving even though the windows were shut. When I pulled them aside, the glow was already there, brighter than before, just hovering in that same suspended space. This time it didn't rise. It stayed exactly where it was, just steady and quiet, like it was waiting. And this time I felt it. The pressure in the air, a subtle heaviness pressing down on my ears and chest, like when an elevator slows too abruptly. A soft clicking noise echoed faintly, not from any one direction, more like an ambient pulse layered into the night. I stood there, heart beating way too fast, unsure if stepping back or staying still was the right move. It remained there another 10 seconds. Then it dimmed and vanished, like a light switched off miles away. The pressure vanished with it. No sound followed, no fading trail, just gone. That night I barely slept. When I checked outside early the next morning, the sky was normal. A few birds perched on the wires, people jogging past, life exactly how it was supposed to look. But my balcony railing felt cool in an odd way, colder than the air should have made it. The next evening, I noticed something else. My neighbor across the way, a guy named Marcus who mostly kept to himself, was standing on his own balcony longer than usual, staring in the same direction. When I stepped out, he glanced over and hesitated before asking, "You seen that light too?" I froze. "You mean over there?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, been happening for a bit, right?" I didn't know whether I felt relieved or more unsettled. We both stood there in silence for a long time, waiting, watching the empty sky above the buildings while the night deepened. And when the glow finally came again, faint and quiet and deliberate, we didn't say anything. We just watched it rise, pause midair, and dissolve. Neither of us tried to explain it. We both pretended it wasn't happening. And eventually we went back inside like nothing had changed. But the hum came back even after the glow disappeared. And I could still feel that faint pressure in the air, long after the night settled back into normal. My car alarm started screaming at exactly 2:03 a.m., loud enough to jolt me straight out of sleep. I sat up in bed for a second, disoriented, trying to figure out if I'd imagined it. Then it blared again, shrill and panicked, echoing across the quiet street. My name is Daniel Ortiz, and I lived in a small rental on the edge of Santa Fe, one of those neighborhoods that looked peaceful during the day and felt hollow at night. I grabbed my phone, saw the time, and muttered something under my breath as I pulled on a hoodie and stepped toward the front window. I pushed the curtain aside and looked down at my sedan parked along the curb. The headlights were off, no one near it, no movement. But right there, hovering maybe a foot above the hood, was something I couldn't make sense of. A faint shimmer, almost like heat rising off asphalt, except it held a loose shape. Not solid, not smoke, just a thin, wavering glow that looked like light bending around nothing. The alarm cut off on its own, leaving everything dead silent. The shimmer hung there for maybe 3 seconds more, then thinned out and vanished like it had never been there. I stood frozen, staring through the window, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. No footsteps, no engine starting, no dogs barking, just the normal distant hum of the city and the occasional rustle of tree branches. I stayed by the window for another full minute before finally heading outside. The night air was cool and dry, and the streetlight cast that dull orange glow over everything. I walked around the car, checked the doors, the hood, the trunk. Everything was locked. No scratches, no dings, nothing disturbed. Still, I didn't feel right about it. The next couple nights went by normally, at least on the surface. I kept checking outside before bed, half expecting to see that shimmer again. Nothing. The car stayed quiet. I almost convinced myself it was a trick of sleep or some random electrical glitch. Then 3 nights later, I noticed something else. Around midnight, while I was washing dishes, my kitchen lights dimmed slightly. Not fully off, just weaker for a second, then back to normal. At the same time, I heard a low, distant hum, like the faintest vibration rolling through the air. It lasted maybe 20 seconds and slowly tapered away. I stepped outside onto the porch and scanned the street. Everything looked normal. No shimmer, no movement. The odd feeling stuck with me though, like something was replaying a moment it wasn't done with yet. 2 nights after that, the alarm went off again. Same time range, 2:10 a.m. This time I was already half awake, restless, scrolling on my phone. I moved to the window and looked down fast. The shimmer was back, suspended above the hood, brighter than before, but still faint, like a veil of light that refused to fully show itself. It didn't cast shadows or reflect off nearby surfaces. It just existed. It hovered there, perfectly still, and I realized the air felt wrong. Thick, pressurized, like the moment before a storm breaks, except the sky was clear. A faint clicking sound started, almost like glass lightly tapping together somewhere just beyond hearing range. It wasn't coming from the car. It wasn't echoing from the houses. It just filled the space around it. After several seconds, the shimmer folded inward on itself, shrinking slightly, then disappeared. The clicking stopped. The alarm went silent. I didn't go back to sleep after that. The next morning, I asked my neighbor Carla if she'd heard my car alarm the night before. She said she heard it but didn't see anything strange. Just shrugged it off like it was some broken sensor. A week went by without anything happening. I tried to return to normal, work, errands, random evenings on the couch, but every night I checked the car before bed, looking for any sign of that same presence. Then it happened again, but not with the alarm this time. I was on my way home, late from a closing shift, when I noticed my street seemed darker than usual. One of the streetlights flickered as I pulled in, then steadied. As I turned off the engine, the same faint hum slid through the air, like a low note you feel more than hear. I stepped out of the car and immediately saw it. Not on the hood this time, but hovering above the windshield, drifting slowly from left to right. The shimmer wasn't sharp or defined. It moved with a strange control, like it observed rather than floated. I stood there, keys still in my hand, unsure whether to move closer or not move at all. The air around me felt heavier with every step I took toward it. My ears popped lightly, like when altitude shifts. I got close enough to see faint ripples inside the shimmer, like something moving beneath the surface of the light itself. No words, no sounds, just that hum. It lingered maybe 10 seconds, then rose upward in a smooth, steady motion and faded into the dark sky, leaving nothing behind except normal air and deep quiet. When I finally went inside, my phone showed I'd been standing there longer than I thought. Almost 15 minutes had passed. I didn't remember all of those minutes. The next day felt slightly off, not in a dramatic way, just subtle things. My watch read a different time than the microwave by several minutes. My car clock reset itself without me touching it. The air still smelled faintly metallic around the vehicle. I kept expecting someone else to mention something, but no one did. That night, I didn't sleep much. I stayed awake, listening for any sound outside, any hint of that low hum. Around 3 a.m., my car alarm didn't go off, but my interior lights flickered inside the house. When I looked out the window, there was no shimmer this time. But the hood of the car reflected something faint from above, a pale glow that wasn't coming from any nearby streetlight. I stepped outside slowly, heart racing, scanning the open air above the roof of my house. Nothing visible, just the same heavy stillness. After a minute or two, the pressure faded and normal night sounds returned. The wind picked up slightly. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere, someone's TV turned on. Everything looked ordinary again. But every time I walked past my car after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something invisible had been there, lingering just above the metal, aware of me in a way I couldn't explain. The alarms never sounded again. The shimmer never returned. But some nights, when the air felt quiet in that wrong way, I still found myself staring out the window at the hood of my car, waiting for the light to come back. A point of light blinked twice, paused, then blinked again, perfectly even, like someone tapping a code they knew by heart. I stood in my parents' backyard with my hands shoved in my hoodie pockets, staring up into a sky that should have been normal and calm. It was just after 11 p.m., cool for early fall, and the only sounds were crickets and a faint breeze moving through the mesquite trees along the fence line. My name is Caleb Moreno, and I'd come out there to clear my head after a long day at the auto shop. My mom, Rosa, had gone to bed already. The house behind me was dark except for the porch light. The blinking point held still in the same patch of sky, not drifting like a plane. Blink, blink, pause, blink, blink. The patterns stayed exact. I watched for at least 20 seconds, expecting it to fade or move, but it didn't. Then, without any easing or arc, it streaked sideways and vanished, faster than anything I'd ever seen. No trail, no fading, just gone. I kept staring at that empty spot, trying to make sense of it. Satellites didn't move like that. Planes didn't either. I stood there longer than I meant to, waiting for another sign of movement. Nothing happened. I finally went back inside and tried to shrug it off, but the image stayed locked in my head. That blink pattern felt deliberate somehow, like it wasn't random. The next few nights, I found myself going back outside around the same time. I didn't tell anyone. It felt weird to even think about explaining it. On the fourth night, the air felt heavier, damp like it might rain, even though the forecast said clear. The stars were out again, and I leaned against the back fence, looking up. After about 10 minutes, I saw it again. Not blinking this time. Just a faint, steady point sitting where no stars should have been. It looked slightly off compared to everything else, like it wasn't quite part of the sky. I squinted, trying to focus. It blinked twice. The same pause, then twice again. My stomach tightened. The repetition made my chest feel hollow, like something unseen was aware I'd noticed. The light stayed still for several seconds before slowly dimming, not disappearing, just becoming harder to see until it blended back into the rest of the sky. I stayed out another half hour, but it never returned. Over the next week, small things started feeling off. My phone lost signal in the backyard more often. The dogs on the next street over barked randomly at night, and then stopped all at once like someone flipped a switch. One morning, I found my car mirrors folded in, even though I knew I didn't touch them. It all felt minor, but my nerves stayed tight, like waiting for something nameless to happen. Then the strangest night came a little over a week later. It had been hot that day, even for New Mexico, and the warmth clung to everything after sunset. I stepped outside around midnight with a cheap folding chair and sat back to cool off. The sky was cloudless, heavy and bright with stars. About 15 minutes in, the same blinking returned, but closer to the horizon this time. Blink, blink, pause. Blink, blink. I whispered, "What the hell?" without even realizing it. The light didn't streak away immediately. Instead, it moved slightly downward, just enough for me to notice, like it was descending slowly but still far away. A low hum started, so faint I thought I imagined it. It didn't come from any direction I could pinpoint. It just existed around me. The dogs nearby went silent. The crickets stopped. Only the hum remained. The blinking slowed, the pauses stretching longer, until the light burned steady and began drifting lower, still distant, but clearly no longer part of whatever star pattern it first blended into. My skin prickled. I wanted to move, but my feet felt strangely rooted to the ground. The light lowered behind the line of trees beyond the empty lot next door. The hum softened and faded with it. Everything returned to normal sound after a few seconds, but my heart stayed racing. The next morning, my neighbor Hector mentioned seeing something weird in the sky around midnight. He laughed it off, said maybe it was a drone or some rich kid playing around. I nodded and pretended that explanation made sense. But deep down, I knew what I saw didn't behave like any drone. The following night, I didn't plan on going outside. I stayed watching TV, trying to block it out, but around 12:30, the power flickered for half a second. Not fully off, just a soft blink, like the lights had briefly lost focus. That same hum crept through the air again, barely audible. I walked to the window, pushed the curtain aside, and looked into the backyard. A muted glow hovered just above the fence line near the mesquite trees. It wasn't blinding or sharp, more like a dim orb, soft-edged, pulsing gently. It didn't cast harsh shadows. It just hovered, steady and calm, like it had been there for a long time. I opened the back door slowly and stepped onto the patio. The air felt thick, warm, and oddly still, like the world was holding its breath. The glow pulsed once, then twice. The same pattern. I swallowed hard, but stayed where I was. It floated slightly upward, drifting with smooth control, then paused again, hanging above the yard like it was observing something it didn't fully recognize. My watch buzzed suddenly on my wrist. The screen lit up with the time, but the seconds seemed off, skipping forward unevenly. I blinked, confused, and when I looked back up, the glow had risen higher, lighter now, almost blending into the dark sky. Then it lifted straight up and vanished, without rushing, without fanfare. The hum stopped immediately after. I checked my phone and realized over 20 minutes had passed, though it felt like only 5. I didn't remember standing there that long. Inside, everything looked normal. My mom slept peacefully. The TV displayed the same paused screen as before, but when I checked the stove clock, it read 12 minutes earlier than my phone. The following days passed with an uneasy calm. I stopped going outside at night, but still found myself scanning the sky whenever I could. A few nights later, while locking the car after work, I noticed that same light again, faint but familiar, positioned higher than before, blinking in that same measured rhythm. This time, instead of fear, it felt more like recognition. It stayed for a minute longer than usual, as if confirming something, then streaked away once more, silent and impossibly fast. I stood alone in the parking lot long after it disappeared, listening to the wind rustle through dry weeds and trying to steady my breathing. When I finally drove home, the sky returned to normal, scattered with ordinary stars that didn't blink in patterns or move against logic. But sometimes, when I looked up late at night, I still found myself searching the same area of sky, half expecting to see that steady, waiting pulse again. My neighbor Diane stopped me as I was pulling the trash bins back toward the garage and asked why I'd been standing in my driveway the night before, just looking up at the sky. She said I'd been there around 1:30 a.m., still as a statue, hands at my sides, staring straight overhead. I told her I hadn't even been home. I'd been over at my sister Marisol's place across town helping her fix a leaky kitchen sink and crashed on her couch afterward. Diane laughed a little, but her eyes didn't. She said, "Well, someone who looked exactly like you was out there." I almost said something. She walked off before I had anything else to say. I stood there for a minute, feeling slightly ridiculous, but also uneasy in a way that didn't have a name. The driveway was just normal, cracked concrete. My old Subaru parked where I left it. Nothing out of place. I double-checked my phone just to reassure myself. My call log showed I'd been on the phone with my sister around that time. My GPS history confirmed I'd been across town. There wasn't any gap or weird spike that suggested otherwise. I tried to brush it off. A couple nights later, I woke up around 2 a.m. for no real reason. The room was quiet except for the hum of the old ceiling fan. My bed felt warmer than usual, and the air was heavy. I rolled over to check the time and noticed a faint light moving across the wall near my closet. It wasn't bright, more like the glow from a passing car, except there hadn't been any engine noise and it wasn't coming from the street-facing side of the house. The glow slid slowly toward the window before thinning out and disappearing. I lay there, listening. The neighborhood was completely still. The next morning, the grass near the end of my driveway looked slightly flattened in a long arc, like someone had stood there shifting their weight for a while, not clear footprints, just pressed down. I convinced myself it was dew and coincidence. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. No name, just a photo. It showed my driveway taken from the sidewalk. And in the photo I was standing there, head tilted back, staring up. Even the hoodie I wore looked right. The timestamp said 1:42 a.m. I stared at it for a long time. I hadn't posed for that. I hadn't even been there. I walked outside and looked up, just out of instinct. The sky was overcast and dull, low clouds hanging like a lid over everything. A faint yellowish glow lingered higher up, too diffused to identify as a streetlight reflection. I went back inside and tried calling the number. It rang once and disconnected. The next few nights felt tense in a slow, quiet way. Nothing dramatic. Just a low sense of being watched, even when I was alone. I kept the porch light on. I checked the driveway before bed. On the 4th night after Diane's comment, I unlocked the front door around midnight after another long day at work. The house felt wrong, not unsafe, just as if the air had been stretched thinner than usual. I set my keys down and noticed a trail of dirt on the entry rug leading toward the hallway, dry like it had been brought in from outside. I hadn't stepped through any. I followed the faint marks until they faded near the kitchen. That night, I dreamed I was standing outside again, in the driveway, looking straight up. But the sky wasn't my normal sky. It was too still, no clouds, no stars, just a smooth, dark surface with a dim, circular patch above me that pulsed slightly, like breathing. I woke up with my heart racing. The clock said 2:11 a.m. My phone was face down on the nightstand, but the screen was on, glowing faintly. When I locked it, I saw the pedometer app had logged a few hundred steps between 120 and 155. I hadn't left the bed. The next day, I ran into Diane again. She hesitated before speaking, like she didn't want to sound foolish. She said she'd seen me again the night before. Same spot, same posture. Looking straight up, I asked her if she noticed anything else. She thought for a second, then said, "There was this sound, like a low buzzing. I figured it was a drone or something, but I couldn't see it." That night, I stayed awake on purpose. I made coffee, sat near the front window, and watched the driveway through the blinds. The streetlights glowed softly. Nothing moved. No one walked by. Around 1:30, my ears caught a faint vibration, so low it felt more like pressure than noise. The porch light flickered once and steadied. Then the front door handle shifted slightly, not turning. Just a gentle rattle like someone brushing past it. I froze in place. The vibration continued for another couple seconds before fading away. I opened the door slowly. Outside, my driveway was empty. The air smelled faintly metallic, sharp and dry. I stepped onto the concrete and looked up. The clouds above were thin and moving fast, except for one patch of sky that stayed perfectly still. A dim ring of pale light hovered there, subtle enough to question, but real enough to track. It pulsed once, twice, the same rhythm as the pedometer steps I didn't remember taking. I stood there, unable to move, feeling like something expected me to remain in place. My phone buzzed inside behind me. When I brought it out, another photo had arrived. Another image of me standing there. Same position, same tilt of the head upward, but this time my face carried a blank expression I didn't recognize as my own. The timestamp was live. Current minute. I looked back up at the pale ring in the sky. It shifted slightly sideways, just a few inches, as if testing space. The air thickened. The vibration returned, low and even. I tried to step backward, and for a second, it felt like my feet resisted, like the ground didn't want to release me. Then sensation returned all at once, and I staggered back onto the porch. The ring of light drifted upward and faded into the moving clouds as though it had never been there. Everything went quiet again. Inside, my phone app showed my step count jumping ahead by another few hundred, even though I was still standing in one spot. I locked the door and sat on the couch until morning, wide awake and shaking. Since then, I kept noticing small things. Footprints in the driveway that didn't match any shoes I owned. Occasional photos appearing in my gallery that I never took. Slight pressure headaches on nights when the sky felt too still. Diane stopped mentioning seeing me outside. But once, as she walked past, she said softly, "You don't look up as much anymore." I didn't answer. Sometimes when I drifted towards sleep, I swore I felt that same faint pull again, like I was expected somewhere just beyond the front door, staring at something silently waiting above the roofline. I saw the second set of headlights just as the fog thickened, bright and close enough that I could have sworn another car was riding right alongside my driver's side. But when I glanced over, there was nothing. No shape, no tires on the wet asphalt. Just empty fog sliding past the window. I slowed down instinctively, squinting through the white haze that swallowed the edges of the road. The real headlights behind me stayed far back and low, maybe someone coming down the hill slower than me, but the second pair hovered near my door, matching my speed like they were attached. The weird part was they didn't reflect off anything. No guardrail shine, no glint on the wet road, just two pale beams floating in the mist. I drove another half mile like that, heart tapping slow and uneven, until the fog thinned and the road opened up. As soon as I could see again, the extra lights just faded out like someone turning a dimmer switch. The actual car behind me was nowhere in sight. I told myself it was just fog tricks and stress. I'd had a long shift at the Marina restaurant, and the drive home through the hills always messed with my depth perception. Still, I couldn't shake how steady those lights had been. The next morning, I checked my car for damage, half expecting to see a scrape down the left side. There was nothing. No marks, no signs anyone had been close. I forgot about it until 2 nights later. Same road, same patch of heavy fog near the bend that overlooked the little creek ravine. This time, I drove slower before I even reached it. The second set of headlights appeared earlier, right beside me, perfectly parallel. Again, no car, just glowing bulbs that didn't flicker or bounce like real ones should. I tapped my brakes. The lights slowed too. I accelerated slightly, they matched that as well. I rolled my window down even though the air was cold and wet, expecting maybe to hear an engine or tires on gravel. All I heard was the hush of fog and my own car humming. The lights stayed with me for maybe a full minute before fading when I passed the curve. When I reached my apartment in Ridgeway, I sat there for a while with the engine off, listening to it tick as it cooled. I kept glancing at the side mirror like those lights might follow me into the parking lot. Over the next week, other little things started feeling off. My headlights seemed dimmer sometimes, even though the bulbs were new. My dash clock reset twice, both times stuck at 22:17 before correcting itself. And once, when I came out for work early in the morning, the hood of my car felt warm, even though it had been parked overnight. On Friday night, my coworker Jonah offered to follow me partway home since we both ended around midnight. He complained about the fog being extra thick and joked about ghost roads. We joked until we reached that same stretch. That's when he called me. "Hey," he said, voice slightly shaky. "Is someone driving next to you?" "What?" I asked, gripping the wheel tighter. "On your left. There are headlights but no car." My breath caught. "You see them too?" "Yeah, they're just hovering there." I forced myself to look again. The lights were right there, same as before. A calm, neutral brightness that didn't behave like normal beams. "Don't slow down," Jonah said. "They're pacing you perfectly." We both drove in silence until the fog thinned and the lights dissolved. When we pulled over at the split where he turned toward his place, he got out and walked to my window. "I don't want to freak you out," he said, keeping his voice low, "but I swear those lights didn't hit the ground at all. They appeared again 2 nights after that. This time, they lingered longer. I kept driving the full length of the fog-covered stretch. The lights never drifted closer or farther, just steady and equal, like company. I started talking out loud without planning to. "Okay, what are you doing?" I muttered, aiming the words at the empty space beside me. Nothing responded. No sound, no movement. Just the unwavering light. When I reached the end of the road and pulled onto the clearer highway, the fog peeled away and the lights vanished again. I barely slept that night. Over the next few days, my phone recorded strange things. GPS showing stops on that road when I knew I hadn't pulled over. A photo in my gallery of the fog taken from inside my moving car, blurry but centered on those floating lights. I didn't remember taking it. The timestamp read 2:19 a.m. On the 5th night, I decided to see what would happen if I stopped. As soon as the second headlights reappeared, I eased onto the shoulder and brought the car to a halt. The fog clung around me, shifting slowly like smoke. The lights stopped too. Now they hovered only inches from where a car should have been. No vehicle body, no silhouette, just empty space glowing. The air outside felt colder against the glass. Still no sound. I cracked the window slightly. The low hum under everything deepened for a few seconds, then softened again. The lights pulsed once, dimming and brightening like a slow breath. Then, without moving across space, they rose straight upward into the fog and disappeared. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. My chest hurt from holding my breath. I stayed parked another minute, then drove the rest of the way home with the radio off, eyes locked forward. They didn't follow me that night. They didn't show up for nearly a week after that either. I started to think whatever it was, maybe it had finished whatever it came there to do. Then, last night, as soon as I hit that familiar stretch, the fog rolled in thicker than I'd ever seen it, and the lights returned, but this time they weren't beside me. They were ahead. 2 glowing orbs hovering directly over the center of the road, low and still, not acting like a car at all, just waiting. When I slowed, they brightened. As I came closer, the low vibration returned in the air, subtle but undeniable, like pressure building inside a sealed space. I stopped a few yards away. The lights didn't move. I didn't move either. After several long seconds, they drifted slightly to the side, like making room for me to pass. I drove through the space they'd occupied. My whole body felt tense as I passed where they hovered, expecting something to brush the side of the car, but nothing touched me. No impact. No resistance. In my rearview mirror, I saw them settle back into the middle of the road after I passed, glowing softly in the fog like a marker left behind. By the time I reached my apartment, the cloud cover had cleared completely. The sky looked normal, quiet, empty. I sat there before going inside, waiting for the feeling to pass, but it didn't completely leave. Even now, when I think about driving that way again, I pictured those lights returning, steady and patient, like they'd simply paused until I came back. And I had a feeling they'd be waiting again next time. The vibration pulled me out of sleep before the light did. It rolled up through the floor like someone running a heavy appliance in the apartment below, except it was soft and steady. Not the usual rattle of someone doing laundry at 3 in the morning. It almost felt like the building itself was humming. I opened my eyes and noticed the room wasn't dark anymore. A pale, cold brightness seeped through the curtains, bright enough to outline the edges of my dresser and the stack of folded clothes on the chair. It wasn't the warm yellow of a street lamp or the blue-white of a car passing by. It was flatter than that, like the whole sky had turned into one dull light source. I pushed myself up on one elbow and checked my phone. 2:36 a.m. The vibration continued, and for a few seconds I just sat there listening to it through my bones. Then, without any gradual fade, it stopped. The light outside blinked back to normal night darkness at the exact same time, like someone flicked a switch. The silence afterward felt heavier than the noise. I sat there waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. After a minute, I told myself it was just the old building shifting or some weird electrical issue. I pulled the covers back up and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I forgot about it until I stepped into the hallway and saw my neighbor Camila standing by her door, staring at the ceiling. "Did you hear that last night?" she asked. "Hear what?" I said, even though part of me already knew. "Some weird humming. Thought my fridge was dying or something. Then this flash like it was daytime for a second." My stomach tightened. "Yeah. I woke up to it too." She frowned. "You think it was a transformer or something?" "Probably," I said, even though my voice didn't sound convinced. The day stayed normal. I went to work, answered emails, tried not to think about it. But that night, it happened again. Same vibration, same faint pressure in the floor, same strange brightness climbing through the curtains. This time, I got out of bed and walked to the window before it faded. I pulled the curtain aside just enough to look out. The street below was empty. No cars, no flashing emergency lights, no neighbors outside. But the sky over the rooftops looked washed out, like someone had pointed a massive floodlight straight down from above the clouds, and then it snapped back into dark. The vibration stopped. I stood there with my hands still on the curtain, waiting to hear sirens or someone shouting or anything that would make it feel normal. But nothing came. Over the next few nights, the pattern repeated. Always between 2:30 and 2:45. Always the same soft tremor. Always the same brief wash of light. I tried recording it on my phone. The first time, the video just showed my dark room, then a split second of brightness, then darkness again. The vibration didn't register at all. It looked harmless, almost boring, which made it feel worse. By the 5th night, I decided to step out onto the balcony when it happened. The vibration started, low and steady. I grabbed a hoodie and moved quietly so I wouldn't wake my roommate, Jason. When I slid the balcony door open, cold air rushed in, carrying that smell you only get right before rain, even though the forecast said clear skies. The light flooded the courtyard again. I stepped out and looked up. The clouds looked thinner than usual, almost smoothed out, and right above the center of the complex, there was a slightly brighter patch, like a dim spotlight behind fabric. It wasn't moving, it wasn't pulsing, it was just there. The vibration deepened slightly, but as intense, it slapped enough that I could feel it in my chest. Then the glow softened and vanished, and the humming stopped. I stayed out there longer than I meant to, staring into the normal dark sky, trying to convince myself I'd overreacted. Later that day, I checked the building's group chat. A few people mentioned weird lights or a strange rumble. No one had an explanation, just guesses about power issues or construction. There was no construction scheduled. 2 nights after that, something changed. The vibration woke me as usual, but this time it didn't feel distant. It felt closer, sharper, as if whatever caused it wasn't far above, but heavy and low. I got up immediately and stepped onto the balcony again. The sky brightened, and this time I saw a faint circular shape in the glow. Not clear, not defined, just a darker disk against the pale light. It looked like something blocking a much stronger source behind it. It didn't spin, it didn't blink. It just hovered silently. I whispered, "What the hell?" without realizing it. No response, no sound, just that unnatural stillness and vibration under my feet. After a few seconds, the glow dimmed and the outline faded until the sky looked empty again. The vibration died off, leaving the world strangely quiet. I barely slept after that. The next day, Camila knocked on my door around noon. She looked tired. "Okay," she said, "are we all just pretending we don't see whatever that is?" "You saw it too?" I asked. "Not details, just that weird bright spot in the sky, same time every night. It's not normal." I nodded slowly. "I saw a shape last night, like something blocking the light." Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't argue. From that night on, the timing shifted. It started happening a little later, closer to 3. The vibration grew more defined, almost rhythmic, like a slow mechanical pulse. I started waking up just before it happened, like my body learned when to expect it. One night, standing on the balcony again, I noticed another detail. The light wasn't just coming from above. It reflected faintly off car roofs in the parking lot and the metal railing around the stairs, times when the source seemed angled, not straight down, like it was moving slightly, repositioning. But I never saw it travel, just appear, hover, disappear. A week into it, I stopped going outside. The feeling of being watched had crept in quietly. Not dramatic, just the sense that whatever caused the light and vibration knew when I noticed it. One night, I stayed in bed and let the vibration roll through the floor while I stared at the ceiling. The room brightened again, ghostly silver, and for a second I thought I saw faint lines of shadow stretch across the ceiling, like light filtering through something solid above the building. Then it faded. The next morning, Jason mentioned something while making coffee. "Hey, have you been going out on the balcony late?" he asked. "No." "Why?" "I woke up once and thought I heard the door slide open. Figured it was you." I shrugged. Must have been the wind. But I knew I hadn't left the room that night. A few evenings later, I checked my phone and saw a step counter spike in the middle of the night. It showed movement between 2:40 and 2:58, but I didn't remember getting out of bed. The vibration still happened. The glow still came. And once, when I forced myself to look out again, I saw the faint circular silhouette than before, just above the neighboring building's rooftop, blocking the sky like a lid. It stayed longer that time, almost a full minute. No sound, no movement, just presence. When it finally faded and the weight of the vibration lifted, the night felt empty in a way that was hard to explain. I went back inside, locked the balcony, and sat on the edge of my bed until my pulse slowed. The next morning, everything looked completely normal. Clear sky, sunlight, no marks, no signs. But every time the night crept closer to that familiar hour, my body tensed on its own. And deep down, I knew the vibration would come again, soft and patient, as if it were marking time. The frost patch caught my eye the second I stepped into the backyard. It sat right in the middle of the grass, like someone had set a plate there and forgotten it. Perfectly round, pale white, and faintly glowing, even though the rest of the lawn was damp and green from the overnight drizzle. It was late fall, early morning, that weird in-between cold that hadn't fully committed yet. The sky was dull and overcast, and a thin layer of fog hung low over the trees behind the property line. I just stood there staring at it with my coffee going cold in my hand. The odd part wasn't even the frost. It was that nothing else was frosted. No cars, no roofs, no shaded patches of dirt, just this one circle of grass about the size of a small kiddie pool. I walked closer, each step slow without meaning to be. The closer I got, the more unnatural it felt, like the air just around the spot was cooler. The grass inside the circle looked stiff and lightly crusted, almost crystalline, while the blades around it were soft and wet. "Okay, what the hell?" I muttered. My neighbor, Ronan, was out on his porch across the fence, rubbing his hands together and smoking his first cigarette of the day. "You see that too?" I called out. He squinted. "What, the fog?" No, the frost, that thing. He leaned forward and stared. That wasn't there yesterday. I know. He didn't say anything else, just nodded like he didn't want to think about it too much. The sun finally broke through the cloud cover a few seconds later. A pale beam hit the frost circle directly, and the whole thing vanished instantly. Not melted, not slowly fading. It just disappeared like someone erased it. I stood there blinking at the normal green grass, half expecting a wet spot or scorch mark or something. There was nothing. No indentation, no damp residue, just regular lawn. I brushed it off as a weird temperature thing and went back inside, but it stayed in the back of my head all day. The next morning, it was there again. Same exact spot, same size, same faint glow. This time, I crouched beside it. The air felt dry closer to the ground, and when I hovered my hand above it, the chill was sharp enough to make my fingers ache slightly. I didn't touch it. Instead, I noticed something else. The grass around the circle leaned inward, as if pressed down earlier and never fully recovered, like weight had rested there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about it, replaying the way it vanished the second the sunlight hit it. Around 2:30 a.m., I ended up standing at the kitchen window, staring into the backyard through the darkness. A soft glow rested on the same spot. Not bright, just noticeable. I watched it for a long time. The fog barely moved, the glow didn't flicker, it didn't cast shadows. It just sat there, quiet and patient. Then, slowly, almost lazily, it dimmed until the yard returned to total darkness. I told myself I imagined it. The third morning, the frost circle was back again, but slightly larger. The edges were sharper too, almost too perfect to be random. I took a photo with my phone, but when I looked at it, the glow barely showed, just a pale, washed-out patch. I sent it to my sister, Talia. She replied, "Looks like fungus or ice or something. Stop staring at your lawn." I laughed it off, but kept watching it. Over the next few days, more strange things started happening. The dog refused to go anywhere near the patch. He'd stop a few feet away and sit, ears flat, eyes locked on the spot like he expected it to move. Once, while I stood near it, I felt a low vibration under my shoes. Not strong enough to shake anything, just a faint internal hum that felt more than heard. The frost kept appearing only overnight, and always vanished the moment the sun touched it. On the fifth night, curiosity finally took over. I grabbed a jacket and stepped barefoot into the damp grass just after midnight. The frost circle glowed softly, lightly illuminating the blades around it. I paced around it slowly. From certain angles, it almost looked slightly raised, like the ground beneath was subtly domed. But there was nothing to physically see. I lowered my hand toward it again and stopped just before touching it. A sound reached my ears, so faint I could have sworn it was my blood rushing. A quiet, steady hum, deep, controlled, almost mechanical but not harsh. I pulled my hand back and waited. The hum kept going, steady and calm, like whatever caused it didn't care that I noticed. Then it slowly faded, leaving only the night sounds behind. The next day, Ronan knocked on my door. "You been doing something weird in the yard?" He asked. "No." "Why?" "There was a strange light out there last night. Thought you were messing around with a spotlight or something." I shook my head. "No lights, just that frost thing." He forced out a laugh. "Yeah, that." That night, the glow returned, but stronger, clearer. The grass inside the circle looked almost white instead of pale blue. I stood at my window, unable to look away. The air above the spot shimmered slightly, bending the view behind it like heat waves on asphalt. And then, just for a second, I noticed something else. A faint outline above the frost, rounded, like the bottom of something hovering barely above the ground. No legs, no support, just shape. Still, silent. I felt cold run through my chest, but I didn't move. After a few seconds, the outline softened and blended into the air, leaving only the glowing frost behind. Then the light dimmed completely, and the normal darkness settled in. The next morning, the frost circle was gone, and it didn't come back. The grass returned to normal. The dog walked freely again. The air felt ordinary, almost too ordinary. But sometimes, if I stood in that exact spot late at night, I swore the ground still felt slightly cooler, slightly heavier, like it remembered. My phone screen lit up on the nightstand at 6:47 in the morning, and the first thing I saw was a photo I definitely didn't remember taking. It showed my backyard, tinted pale and flat like moonlight, but brighter, like everything had been lightly rinsed in silver. The timestamp sat in the corner, 3:12 a.m. I hadn't been up at 3:12. I'd gone to bed just after midnight, scrolled for maybe 10 minutes, and passed out hard. I slept straight through until the alarm. No late bathroom break, no half-awake wandering, nothing. I sat up and opened the image. The photo was clear, too clear for a random pocket tap. You could see the outline of the maple tree, the old swing set, the shed in the back corner. The grass looked almost white under the light, like it had been dusted with something fine. There were no shadows I recognized, just a strange, even glow washing everything. I checked my camera app history. That single image was there, saved normally, like I'd taken it on purpose. No burst photos, no accidental video. Just that. I called my friend Jessa while I made coffee. "You ever wake up to a random picture on your phone?" I asked. "No? What kind of picture?" "Backyard, at 3 in the morning." She paused. "You sleepwalk or something?" "Not that I know of." "Well, maybe you couldn't sleep." I would remember standing outside at 3 in the morning. "Kermit," I said. She laughed, but it sounded forced. "Just delete it and move on." I said I would, but I didn't. I spent most of that day uneasy. Every time I walked past the back window, I felt like I was checking on something, even though nothing looked different. The grass was green again. The shed sat where it always had. The sky was normal. That night, I locked the back door carefully, checked the windows, double-checked really, then left the phone face down on the nightstand. Sometime during the night, a faint light brushed across my bedroom ceiling. It stirred me just enough to drift closer to awake, but not enough to fully move. I remember thinking it looked wrong compared to normal streetlight glow. It was softer, cleaner, then it faded. When I fully woke up, the phone was face up, and there was another photo. 3:14 a.m., backyard again. Brighter, the grass almost glowed now. The same pale wash filled the entire frame, but this time, something looked off. In the far corner near the fence line, there was a blur, slightly darker than the rest. It wasn't shaped like a person, not really, but it wasn't nothing either. Just a low, rounded distortion, like the air itself had weight. I zoomed in. The pixels blurred. No detail came through. I stood outside that morning and stared at the exact spot where the blur should have been. Nothing. No marks, no dead grass, nothing disturbed. That night, I stayed awake on purpose. I set my phone on the dresser facing the backyard through the sliding door, camera open, screen dark. I watched the clock tick past midnight, then 1, then 2. My eyes felt heavy, but I refused to lie down. At 3:11, something changed in the air. A low hum slipped through the house, barely audible but steady, like distant machinery or pressure moving slowly. My skin prickled and the hairs on my arms lifted. The backyard began to brighten. A pale light poured down from above, clean and even, like it wasn't coming from any lamp or angle. The grass glowed under it, every blade outlined with soft white. Then the phone camera activated on its own. The screen stayed dark, but I heard the quiet shutter sound. Once, again. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Outside, in that same corner by the fence, the air thickened. The glow dimmed just slightly there, as if something interrupted it. A shape began to take form, low to the ground, smooth on top, not sharp or mechanical looking, just present. Too solid to be fog, too subtle to clearly see. It didn't move forward. It didn't move back. It just hovered there, quiet. The hum deepened, vibrating faintly through the floorboards under my feet. The air inside the room felt denser, heavy against my chest. Then, as slowly as it had come, the light faded. The shape dissolved with it, sinking into the darkness like it was never separate from it to begin with. The humming thinned until it disappeared completely. The yard returned to normal night. The phone screen lit up a moment later with another saved image. 3:12 a.m. This one showed the glow clearer. And the shape, still blurred, still undefined, but unmistakably there. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to go outside right away. I drank my coffee by the kitchen window, watching the grass, the fence, the shed. Everything looked normal. Birds eventually returned. Wind stirred the leaves. It looked like a regular backyard again, but I knew what I'd seen and what I hadn't moved for. It didn't happen every night after that. Some nights passed with nothing. No photos, no light, no hum. And then randomly, the camera would catch another image, always around 3:12. Always that same pale wash, always that same corner. Sometimes the photo showed only light. Sometimes the blur returned. Once I thought the shape looked slightly larger, closer to the middle. I never went out there when it happened. I couldn't convince my legs to move. Instead, I watched through the glass trying to understand if it noticed the house, the windows, me, if it even cared. The last time it appeared, the light lasted longer than usual, almost a full minute. I stood frozen behind the sliding door, the cool glass against my palm, staring as the yard turned silver again. The shape formed once more, hovering low, smooth, silent. And then it drifted just slightly to the side, not directly forward, just shifted like testing space. The hum deepened for a moment, then everything vanished again. No noise, no flash, just darkness and ordinary night. The next morning, my phone was blank. No images, no timestamps, as if it had never happened at all. But when I stepped outside, the spot in the corner felt different under my bare feet. The grass was cooler there, slightly flattened, and whenever I checked the time late at night now, my eyes always seemed to land on 3:12 without meaning to. I heard the hum before I saw anything, which was weird because the valley was usually loud as hell this time of year. Crickets, wind through the grass, a dog barking from some distant property line. But that morning, all of that faded out like someone turned the volume down one notch at a time. I was halfway up the Whetstone Ridge Trail, just outside Paonia, still cool enough that my breath fogged up in front of my face. I'd left my truck at the small gravel lot before sunrise because I liked hitting the overlook right when the light started coming in. The sky was pale blue, almost washed out, and thin fog hugged the low parts of the valley like someone spilled milk overnight and never cleaned it up. The hum started low, more like a vibration in my chest than a sound. At first, I assumed it was some farm equipment running far below me or maybe a plane, but when I stopped walking, it didn't fade or drift like those usually did. It just stayed, steady. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line, then the open slope. Nothing moved. No birds flying, no branches swaying. The fog sat unnaturally still. I kept walking, telling myself I was overthinking it. Every few steps, the sound seemed to shift slightly to my left, then to my right, like it was pacing me without actually being in one place. After about 10 minutes, I realized something else felt wrong. My phone showed I'd been walking that stretch for way longer than usual. The trail curved the same way it always did, but I didn't remember that cluster of jagged rocks near the edge or that bent pine that leaned out over the path. Everything looked familiar and off at the same time. The hum grew clearer. Not louder, just clearer, almost layered, like more than one tone stacked together. I finally reached a point where the trees thinned and the valley opened wide below. Normally that view was my favorite thing. That morning it felt more like I was standing on the edge of something that didn't want me there. Far out over the valley, maybe half a mile away, a dull patch in the air caught my eye. It wasn't light or dark exactly, just slightly smoother than the space around it, like looking through heat over asphalt. It didn't match the movement of the fog or the air currents, it just hung there, silent, suspended. The hum shifted again, now seeming to come from that exact point. I stood still, heart thumping too hard, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But when I took a step to the side, the distortion didn't change with my angle. It stayed put, just hovering. Then slowly it slid sideways. Not fast, just enough to notice, like it was scanning the terrain below. A cold weight settled in my stomach. I checked behind me, half expecting someone else to be on the trail, but I was completely alone. No voices, no footsteps, not even the crunch of animals nearby. The hum deepened and the fog below shifted barely, almost like it responded. I backed up a few steps, then another, never breaking eye contact with that patch of air. My boot caught a root and I nearly went down, which snapped me out of whatever trance I'd slipped into. I turned and started walking back down the trail, not fast enough to look panicked, but definitely not at the calm pace I'd come up with. Behind me, the sound drifted again, matching my direction. Every time I slowed, it slowed. When I stopped for a second time and turned around, the distortion lay closer than before. Not by much, but enough that I could see the trees behind it looked warped, slightly stretched, like someone pinched the image and pulled it forward. I swallowed and kept moving. The longer I walked, the more the world felt off. My steps sounded duller. The air felt heavier on my skin, and the hum stayed right there, never fully ahead or behind, just near enough to let me know it was still present. At one point, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a message. Nothing was there, no notifications, just my screen unlocked on its own. The time read 9:03 a.m. I knew I'd started just after 6. That didn't line up, not even close. A sudden pressure rolled through my ears, like when you drive too fast down a mountain road and the hum wobbled for a second, then steadied. I glanced up again. The distorted patch had grown wider, taller, still featureless, still smooth, like empty air pretending to have shape. It didn't rush me. It didn't close the distance aggressively. It just stayed parallel, watching in its own way, if that's what it was doing. I reached the final bend before the lot and practically jogged the rest of the way down. When I broke through the trees and saw my truck sitting alone on the gravel, the hum dipped slightly, like it recognized a boundary. I unlocked the door, climbed in, and shut it hard. The sudden silence inside the cab felt too clean, too absolute. Outside, the air looked normal. No distortion, no shimmer, just morning and pine and damp earth. But the hum lingered faintly, like it was circling the perimeter. I sat there for a full minute before starting the engine. When I finally pulled out and drove down the narrow road, I watched the slope through my rearview mirror until the trail had vanished behind the bend. The sound faded slowly as distance grew between us. Later that day, I checked my hiking app. According to it, I hadn't moved for nearly 40 minutes in the middle of that trail. A dead stop right where the valley opened. No explanation. No pause logged. Just a flat line. I didn't hike that trail again after that. But sometimes, when the house fell quiet late at night and the windows rattled just slightly in the breeze, I swore I could hear the same soft hum carrying through the hills, moving without direction, like it was still tracing paths out there, waiting for me to step back into its range again. I saw the light before I even realized I was paying attention to the sky. I was parked on the edge of Route 380, just outside of Escalante, Utah, where the pavement faded into dirt and scrub. The sun had already dropped behind the mesas, and the whole horizon sat in that dusty orange-pink color that never quite looked real. The air was warm and dry, and the wind came in short, uneven bursts that rattled the dead weeds along the shoulder. I'd pulled over to stretch my legs and take a break from driving. I'd been on the road since mid-morning and still had another hour before I'd hit the tiny motel I'd booked. My phone had no signal, and the radio kept fading in and out, so everything felt quiet in that wide, empty way the desert had at dusk. That's when I noticed the point of light. It wasn't bright like a plane or sharp like a star. It looked dull, almost soft, moving slowly along the horizon line, barely clearing the tops of the dark ridges in the distance. At first, I assumed it was a helicopter or maybe someone driving on one of those remote back roads, even though there were no visible headlights cutting through the terrain. It drifted from left to right, steady and calm. No blinking, no variation, just a smooth glide like it had a set path. I leaned against my truck and kept watching, mostly out of boredom. The longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't moving the way anything normal moved. There was no wobble, no slight rise or dip. It held the same height, the same speed, like it was sliding on an invisible line. Then it stopped, dead still. I checked my watch, more as a reflex than anything else. The desert around me felt quieter somehow, like even the wind took notice. The light lingered there, hovering just above the ridgeline, and I felt that dull pressure in my chest you get when something feels wrong, but you can't place why. After maybe 5 seconds, it dropped straight down. No arc, no gradual descent, just a clean vertical fall like someone yanked a string from above. It vanished behind the dark stretch of land, and that was it. No explosion, no glow on the ground, nothing. I stood there waiting for something else to happen, half expecting it to pop back up or reappear farther down the horizon. It didn't. Instead, the air around me felt heavy, like the temperature shifted a few degrees without the weather actually changing. The wind died for a second and my skin broke out in a faint sweat that had nothing to do with the heat. I climbed back into my truck and sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the spot where the light had fallen. I tried making sense of it. Satellite? Military test? Reflection? None of it lined up in my head. When I finally started driving again, the road ahead felt different. Not visually, just off. The usual landmarks I'd kept track of earlier felt like they were coming up later than they should. My dashboard clock ticked on normally, but I had a weird sense that more time had passed than what it showed. About 10 minutes later, I noticed another odd thing. My GPS claimed I was still 2 miles out from the bend that led toward town, even though I could clearly see the turn coming up. I slowed down, thinking the map might be behind, but when I reached the curve, the screen blinked, then updated like it had just caught up. I laughed under my breath, trying to shake it off. The farther I drove, the more I felt like something stayed just out of sight, not following exactly, but aware. Every time I glanced sideways, half expecting to see another light, there was only dark land and fading color in the sky. I reached the motel right after full dark set in, a plain low building with a few flickering yellow bulbs outside and a tired-looking sign. The owner, a guy named Martin, handed me a key and barely looked up from his little TV. None of it felt unusual, and somehow that made the drive here feel even stranger. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and replayed the moment over and over. The glide, the pause, the drop, the way it vanished without a trace. I checked the time on my phone again. 32 minutes had passed since I'd first pulled over on the highway. It felt closer to an hour. Later, when I cracked the curtains just enough to peek outside, the sky was clear and full of stars. No strange lights, no movement, just open space. I went to sleep eventually, but the image of that light dropping straight down stayed burned behind my eyes. Every time I shifted in bed, I half expected to see that dull glow lingering at the edge of vision, hovering just out of frame, waiting to slide back into sight like it had never really left at all. The sky shifted color so fast I thought my eyes had glitched. I was standing at the edge of the small pier in Rockport, Maine, tying down my kayak before heading back to my apartment. It was late, around 11:30, and the weather felt damp and unsettled, like rain was hovering but not committing. The moon had been thin and pale, barely showing through the low cloud cover, and everything looked washed out in that soft blue-gray nighttime tone. Then the sky went dull. Not darker, not brighter, just flat and gray, like someone rubbed a thumb across the whole night. It happened overhead, not on the horizon. The air seemed heavier at the same time, almost pressing down on my shoulders. It felt like something massive had just passed over everything, but there was no wind shift, no sound, no vibration under my feet. The water stayed still. The dock didn't move. The lights from the harbor didn't flicker. It only lasted maybe 2 seconds before the sky returned to normal, but the silence afterward felt stretched. I stood there frozen for a moment with the rope half wrapped around my hand, staring up at the clouds. They looked the same as before, patchy and low, drifting slowly inland. No planes, no helicopters, no thunder. I told myself it was just weird lighting or my eyes adjusting, and kept working, but the feeling didn't fade. Something about it clung to me, like when you walk through a spider web you didn't see. My phone buzzed a few seconds later. A text from my neighbor, Lila, asking if I was home yet because her bathroom light had turned on by itself again. I half smiled at that, assuming she just needed another shared living rant. I typed back that I was still at the pier and asked why. Before she replied, I heard a soft, dull thump somewhere nearby. Not sharp, more like something settling. I turned toward the old storage building at the far end of the dock, expecting to see a cat or maybe someone finishing up fishing gear. The area stayed empty. That same uneasy pressure returned in my chest, just subtle enough to make me pause. I finished tying the kayak faster than I planned and walked back along the pier. Every few steps I glanced up again, half expecting the sky to flatten out once more. It didn't, but the clouds had shifted into a darker band above the harbor, thicker than the rest. By the time I reached the shore path, Lila had replied. She said her dog had been standing at the back door, whining and staring up, like it was tracking something over the yard, and then the dog bolted into the hallway and hid under the table. I laughed it off in my message back. even though it didn't really feel funny. As I walked home, the streetlights seemed slightly dimmer than usual, like they were pushing through more haze than normal. A mist hung low in the air, not quite fog, just enough to blur the outlines of the houses along the road. Everything felt slowed, like time had stretched thin. When I reached my building, I noticed another strange detail. The old maple tree beside the front steps had a long patch of bark scraped clean on one side, as if something had brushed against it hard enough to leave a mark but not broken enough to snap any branches. I didn't remember seeing that earlier in the day. Inside my apartment, the air felt stale and cool, even though I'd left the windows slightly cracked. I set my bag down and glanced toward the balcony. The ocean wasn't visible from here, but the sky was, still the same uneasy, clouded look. I sat on the couch for a long minute just listening. No traffic, no voices, just the faint hum of the building and the sound of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then my wall clock ticked louder than usual, and I realized at some point I'd lost track of how long I'd been standing out there earlier. My legs felt tired, like I'd walked farther than just the short drive from the pier. I checked my phone. The last message I'd sent Lila only showed as delivered, not read, even though she normally responded right away. I tried calling her. It went straight to voicemail. Through the balcony door, the sky shifted again. Not as dramatic as before, but just enough to make me lean forward. A faint grayness spread for a second, almost like a shadow moving faster than clouds could. It faded just as quickly. A low whisper of sound passed through the air, almost like wind brushing over wire. But outside the trees didn't sway and the curtains barely moved. It was there and gone in less than a breath, leaving the space feeling hollow. I kept the balcony door open and watched carefully, trying to catch another glimpse. Nothing unusual showed itself. No lights, no objects, no movement I could point to and explain. Eventually, Lila texted back saying her lights were fine again and her dog was acting normal, like nothing had happened. She added a question mark and asked what I meant about being at the pier. I stared at the screen for a second before typing that I'd explain tomorrow. I stayed up long past when I usually slept, convincing myself the whole thing was just a strange weather moment or my brain playing tricks in low light. Still, every time the ceiling creaked or the building settled, I glanced toward the window, half waiting for that same flat gray veil to slide across the night again. It never did. But the feeling that something enormous had quietly passed over everything, close enough to change the sky without making a single sound, didn't leave when morning came either. The streetlight above me flickered twice and went dead, leaving the sidewalk in a softer, uneven darkness. I was walking back from the corner store on Maple Ridge Drive, the one that stayed open too late and always smelled like microwaved pizza. It was just after midnight, and a light rain had started turning the pavement slick and reflective. The air felt cool and damp, not cold, but heavy enough to sit on my skin. I had my hood up and my phone tucked in my pocket, trying to keep it dry. When the light went out, I stopped without really thinking. There was still enough glow from the next block over to see, but it didn't feel the same. Everything around me looked flatter, like the contrast had been lowered. That's when I noticed the soft glow further down the street. It wasn't bright or sharp, just a pale haze moving slowly between two parked cars near the cul-de-sac. It looked like someone walking with a dim flashlight pointed low, except the light didn't bounce or jitter. It just drifted, smooth and steady, about waist height above the ground. I watched it slide past a silver sedan, then weaken slightly, then brighten again, like it was breathing. No footsteps, no shadow, no beam hitting the ground. I whispered hello without meaning to. The word came out thin and unsure and sank into that quiet stretch of road. The glow kept moving, unbothered, drifting closer to the line of hedges that bordered the abandoned lot on the corner. I took a few cautious steps forward, shoes squeaking faintly against the wet asphalt. As soon as I shifted, the glow slowed, almost pausing, then kept moving again, fading as it went. By the time it reached the fence at the far end, it had grown faint, like fog lit from the inside. Then it just thinned out and disappeared completely. The street stayed silent. I stood there a moment longer, heart tapping lightly against my chest, trying to convince myself I'd just seen some weird reflection or car light. There were no moving vehicles, though. No one else on the road, just rain and empty houses. I finally continued home, glancing over my shoulder a few times, even though the streets stayed normal. The broken streetlight above me didn't hum or try to come back on. When I reached my porch, the sensor light flicked on automatically, bright and sharp, making everything feel too real again. Still, that soft glow image was stuck behind my eyes. Inside, my roommate Jordan was already asleep, his door shut. The apartment felt quiet in that familiar late-night way, with the hum of the fridge and the faint drip from the bathroom faucet. I set the grocery bag on the counter and noticed the microwave clock blinked, like the power had briefly cut out. The stove timer was reset too. Jordan hadn't mentioned anything earlier that evening. I checked my phone. No weather alerts, no neighborhood posts about outages, just normal stuff. Around 1:40, after changing clothes, I went to bed, but kept the blinds slightly open so I could see the street if I needed to. I lay there staring at the faint outline of the lampposts and trees, replaying the moment the glow slid between those cars. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed softly. A text from my neighbor across the hall, Marisol. She asked if I'd seen anything strange outside. I hesitated before replying, then asked why. She said the hallway had gone dim for a second, like someone passed in front of every light at once, and her cat refused to leave the window afterward. I told her the streetlight went out and left it at that. She didn't respond again. Sometime after that, a faint tapping noise came from my bedroom window. Not knocking, just barely audible, like tiny pebbles brushing the glass. I slowly sat up, half expecting to see a branch or maybe the rain picking up. There was nothing. The tree outside didn't reach that far. The rain was steady but light. Then a dim patch of brightness passed over the edge of the window frame, slow and careful, like it was testing the space. The glow was weaker than before, more diffused, but the texture felt the same. Soft, controlled, not reflecting off anything. My throat tightened. I didn't move. The light crept upward, just barely brushing the top of the blinds so that the tiny dust particles glinted for a moment. Then it thinned and slid away out of sight. No sound followed. No movement in the street. Nothing that made sense. I stayed sitting up for what felt like ages, listening hard, waiting for any sign of footsteps or a car engine or someone laughing outside. It stayed eerily quiet, even the rain seeming muted. At some point, I noticed the faint smell of metal in the air, sharp and clean, like after touching a battery. It faded after a minute or so. I finally lay back down with the blanket pulled higher, eyes fixed on the dim outline of the window. I never really fell into deep sleep, just hovered in that uneasy, half-awake space. When morning came, the streetlight outside was working again like nothing had happened. I checked the spot where the glow had drifted the night before. No marks, no disturbances, just wet tire tracks and scattered leaves. Jordan asked why I looked tired, and I shrugged it off, saying I didn't sleep well. As I left for work later, Marisol opened her door at the same time. She looked pale, tired like me. She asked quietly if the light I saw looked like fog illuminated from within. I nodded before I even thought about it. We didn't say anything else. I woke up with that weird tight feeling in my chest, like someone had just left the room and I'd missed it by a second. The kind where you sit there in the half-dark and try to listen harder than normal. My first thought was that Toby, my dog, must have jumped off the bed and bumped into something, but he was still curled up against my legs, snoring lightly. The room was dim, but not completely dark. A faint bluish light crept around the edges of the curtains, like dawn was trying to poke through early. I glanced at the clock, 4:18 a.m. Then I noticed the light shifting. I pushed myself up and slid the curtain aside an inch. Beyond the backyard, past the chain link fence and the thin stretch of dead grass, the tree line glowed faintly. Not bright, just enough to notice. It wasn't stationary either. It was pulling away, moving slowly upward and back like something retreating. The glow thinned as it moved and then sank behind the dark line of trees. Within seconds, it was gone. The woods looked normal again, black, flat, quiet. I stood there a moment longer, staring at the same patch of trees, waiting for it to reappear. It didn't. A strange calm settled in after that, but my skin still felt prickly, like static. I checked the door to the deck and the windows, just in case. Everything was locked, no signs of anything being messed with. No noises outside, just the quiet hum of the fridge and the soft snore of Toby. I tried to go back to sleep, but it never really happened. I drifted a little, then snapped awake each time the floor creaked or a car passed on the road a mile away. Around 6, the sky finally started to lighten for real. I pulled on a hoodie and stepped onto the back porch to get a better look at the tree line. Fog hung low over the ground, thin and patchy, the kind that shows up in late fall when the air doesn't know what it wants to be yet. The spot where the glow had been looked untouched. No broken branches, no flattened grass, no weird tracks, just the same muddy ground and sparse weeds that had always been there. I made coffee and tried to convince myself it had been some kind of reflection or maybe a drone from one of the farms further out. Still, it didn't feel like either of those. Later that morning, my sister Avery called to ask if I'd slept okay. She lived 2 towns over, but worried about me ever since I moved out to this semi-rural place on the edge of Ringwood. I told her I was fine and almost mentioned the light, then stopped. I didn't feel like explaining something I didn't even understand myself. By afternoon, the whole thing felt distant enough to ignore. I ran errands, took Toby for a walk, fixed the loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet. The normal stuff filled the hours, but every now and then my eyes drifted back to the tree line behind the yard. That evening, the air cooled quickly. Clouds rolled in low and thick, turning the sky a dull gray. No stars, no moon, just a blanket of overcast pressing down. Around 9:30, the power flickered for a second and came back. The porch light dimmed, then steadied. I stared at it harder than needed. That's when Toby started acting strange. He walked to the sliding glass door and stood there with his ears stiff and his tail low, staring toward the trees. A soft, whining sound slipped out of his throat. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just watched. I stepped up beside him and looked out. Nothing moved. I opened the door slightly and a cool, damp smell drifted inside. Leaves rustled faintly, but there wasn't much wind. Somewhere in the distance, a single bird made an awkward chirping sound, then stopped. I stepped onto the deck. The yard looked normal, but the air felt heavier than it should have, like the humidity thickened with something else mixed in. I walked halfway across the grass, my boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. Each step felt louder than usual. Then I noticed a faint shimmer hovering just above the ground near the back fence. It wasn't solid, more like rippling air, catching what little light the clouds let through. It moved. Slowly, almost carefully, sliding sideways along the fence line. Every few seconds it thinned, then returned, like it was adjusting to the space. I whispered Toby's name, even though he hadn't followed me out. The sound barely made it past my throat. The shimmer lifted slightly and drifted toward the trees, then disappeared into the darker shadows between the trunks. The air felt suddenly lighter, like pressure released. I didn't move for a bit, just stood there trying to make sense of it. My breath came out in short clouds. I hadn't realized how cold I'd gotten until that moment. Inside, Toby let out a soft bark, then fell quiet again. I stepped back slowly, never turning my eyes from the spot where the shimmer had vanished. Once I reached the porch, I shut the door and locked it, even though it was already locked before. That night, I slept lightly again. Sometime after midnight, I stirred to the faintest vibration through the floorboards. It wasn't loud enough to be a truck passing. It wasn't steady enough to be an appliance. A low hum settled in the air for a few seconds, like the sound of something distant moving through fog. Then silence. I checked my phone. No notifications, no alerts. Just the lock screen glow fading out again. I didn't look outside this time. I turned onto my side and waited for the hum to return. It never did. Morning came dull and gray. I stepped outside early to help my neighbor Marcus bring in some of his firewood after the rain. He lived a little ahead, closer to the tree line than anyone else on our stretch. He squinted at me and asked if I'd been outside late the night before. I hesitated before answering no. He nodded slowly and said he could have sworn he saw light moving past his shed, low and silent, but when he grabbed his flashlight, it was gone. We stood there a moment longer without speaking, the fog wrapping around our ankles like thin smoke. When I headed back to my place, my gaze kept drifting toward the trees. Nothing stood out, no glow, no motion, just the quiet woods waiting the way they always did. The inside of my car lit up pale blue like someone had flipped on a ghost version of the dome light, except nothing actually turned on. My hands froze on the steering wheel. The radio screen stayed dark. The dashboard stayed the same, dull orange. The glow just filled the space, soft and cold, like it didn't belong to any normal source. I blinked a few times and looked around, waiting for my eyes to adjust or my phone to start buzzing or something, but nothing changed. The glow hung there for maybe 2 or 3 seconds, then drained away like water seeping out of a sink. Suddenly it was just me and the dark again, parked on the side of Old Quarry Road with the engine still idling. I sat there breathing too fast, staring through the windshield at an empty stretch of gravel and weeds. I kept waiting for another flash or noise, but the night stayed quiet. I'd pulled over there because I missed a call from my cousin Renee and was trying to figure out if I should call back. It was late, close to 11:40 p.m., and the road was shut down a mile ahead for construction. I figured I'd just sit there and deal with the call, then head home through the side streets. After the glow disappeared, my phone finally showed normal again. No weird brightness, no new notifications, just Renee's missed call from a few minutes earlier. I called her back, but it went to voicemail. I tried telling myself it had been some kind of reflection. Maybe a car passed on the main road behind me, except I hadn't heard anything, and there weren't any houses or lights close enough to cause that kind of glow. I checked the rearview mirror. Nothing but darkness and the dull outline of my back seat. Still parked, still quiet, still too calm. I forced myself to shift into drive and started moving again, slow and careful toward the turnoff. The tires crunched over gravel, and the sound felt louder than it should have been. I kept glancing down at the dashboard, half expecting the glow to come back. It didn't. I turned onto Birch Trail Drive and headed toward my apartment complex on the east side of town. By the time I reached the first streetlight, my nerves had softened a little. Streetlights meant normal. Houses meant normal. The world working the way it was supposed to. I told myself to forget it. Then it happened again. The second time was weaker, almost like an afterimage, but it filled the car just enough for me to notice. A faint wash of blue slid across the windshield and bled onto the passenger seat. I swerved slightly and corrected, heart hammering hard enough I could feel it in my throat. This one faded even quicker. I pulled into the empty parking lot of a closed hardware store, rolled the window down, and listened for anything at all. Wind, footsteps, a distant engine, something. All I heard was the faint squeak of the loose sign above the store entrance and the hum of the power lines overhead. I got out and stepped under the open sky. The air smelled faintly metallic, sharp and cold like damp coins. I looked around, scanning the lot. A few cars sat abandoned near the far fence. No one else stood nearby. No movement. Slowly, I tilted my head up. The sky was overcast, thick clouds blocking the stars. But above the parked car, I noticed a faint haze, barely visible. Not cloud, not fog, just a subtle distortion in the air, like heat waves above asphalt during summer. Only it hovered perfectly still. I stepped backward without realizing it, then bumped into my own door. The haze drifted a few feet sideways, then thinned until I couldn't see it anymore. I stood there for a moment longer, jaw tight, hands numb at my sides. When nothing else happened, I climbed back in, locked the doors, and drove home faster than I normally did. Inside my apartment, the silence felt heavier than usual. My upstairs neighbor, Miranda, always played music at night, but tonight, her place stayed quiet. I left the hallway light on and sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone, replaying the soft blue glow in my head. I checked the internet for local outages. Nothing. No alerts. I checked the weather radar. Just low clouds and a slight breeze. Around 1:10 a.m., I finally crawled into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time my eyes started to close, I pictured the inside of my car filled with that light. I grabbed my phone, checked the clock again, then placed it face down on the nightstand. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke suddenly to a faint buzzing sound, not loud enough to identify, but strong enough to pull me out of sleep. The room looked normal. No strange light, no shadows in the corners. Just the dull reflection of the street lamp filtering through the blinds. The buzzing faded slowly. I stayed still, staring at the ceiling fan until my breathing steadied. Morning light crept in eventually, gray and flat behind clouds. I forced myself through a shower, through coffee, through getting dressed for work. It all felt slightly off, like my head was still a step behind the rest of me. When I walked to my car, I paused beside the driver's door. I half expected to see some mark or smudge or anything different. The paint looked the same, no scratches, no fogging, no strange residue. Everything looked normal. At work, my coworker Jalen asked if I looked tired. I brushed it off, told him I slept weird. He laughed and said same, then went back to his desk. Still, the longer the day went on, the more uneasy I felt about what happened the night before. Not panicked, just unsettled, like I'd stepped into the wrong moment somehow and didn't know how to step back out. That night, I drove home earlier, sticking to well-lit roads. No glow, no strange haze, just normal traffic and streetlights. When I pulled into my apartment parking spot and turned off the engine, I sat there a minute longer, listening. The silence pressed in gently, the way it usually did. Right before I opened the door, the rearview mirror shimmered faintly with the softest hint of blue. It barely lasted a blink, just enough to know it was there. Then nothing. I stepped out, shut the door, and walked inside, trying to look back. The parking lot stayed dark and ordinary behind me, just cars and pavement and the faint hum of the night settling into place. I pulled my phone out to take a photo of the clouds as they slid past the moon, mostly because the light looked strange against the water and I had nothing else to do. I'd driven out to the overlook just north of Port Orford after getting off my shift at the Marina Cafe. It was close to midnight and windy in that cold, stubborn coastal way that never fully died down. The air smelled like salt and wet rock, and the waves sounded heavier than usual, like they were hitting something solid all at once. I'd parked by the rusted guardrail where people usually stop to look out, but the small lot was empty except for my car. The sky hadn't been clear. Thick clouds kept drifting in front of the moon, breaking the light into uneven patches. I took a few photos, just tapping the screen without really thinking. In the moment, it felt normal. Quiet. A little lonely, but that wasn't new for me. When I looked down at my screen to scroll through them, one of the frames looked wrong. There was a dark oval shape sitting among the clouds, like a shadow with no real depth. It wasn't sharp or solid, just a smooth, dark form hovering in the middle of the lighter cloud cover. The moonlight was still there around it, but that one shape absorbed everything. It looked like it didn't belong to the rest of the sky. I swiped back and forth between the photos. The oval shape showed in only one. The ones before and after were just normal clouds, soft and uneven, nothing strange. At first I figured it was some weird camera glitch, a smudge on the lens maybe. I wiped the screen on my sleeve and held the phone back up, taking another photo. Nothing. I waited a few seconds and took another. Still nothing. I looked up with my own eyes, trying to spot that same shape in the sky, but there was nothing there, just clouds moving slowly across the moon. A breeze moved past the bluff and rustled the low bushes near the parking area. It felt louder than it should have been. I caught myself glancing around the empty lot, checking for other cars even though I already knew I was alone. I tried to laugh it off and slipped my phone into my pocket, but a strange feeling settled in my chest. Like something had slightly shifted, and I didn't know what. I walked closer to the edge of the overlook, hands in my jacket pockets, and stared out at the water. The ocean looked darker than the sky, almost flat. A faint line of white foam flickered far below where waves hit the rocks. That was when I noticed a dull light hovering low over the water. It wasn't bright, more like a smudge of pale gray glowing just above the surface. It moved slowly, too steady to be a boat, but not fast enough to be a reflection. I kept blinking, trying to figure it out. The light drifted left, then paused. No sound came with it. No motor. No splash. I looked back at the parking area for a second, suddenly aware of how isolated the spot was. The main road sat a few hundred feet back, but I couldn't see cars from where I stood. Only the wind and the water kept moving. When I looked back toward the ocean, the light was gone. I told myself it was probably some distant buoy or a reflection off a wave since the moonlight kept shifting. That explanation felt weak, but I held on to it anyway. I pulled my phone out again and scrolled to the strange photo one more time. The oval shape still sat in the exact same place among the clouds, like it had been placed there deliberately. I zoomed in, but it only blurred, losing any real detail. A low sound came from somewhere behind me. Not footsteps, more like gravel being shifted, slow and uneven. I turned slightly, half expecting to see another car pulling in or someone at the edge of the lot, but there was no one. The shape of my car sat dull and still under the weak glow of the single broken street lamp. The sound happened again, closer. I stayed still, listening. My stomach felt tight like it did when a storm rolled in too fast. Nothing else followed. No voices. No engine. Just silence again. I pocketed the phone and walked back toward my car, trying not to hurry but not slow either. The wind kept brushing against the back of my neck and shoulders, making it feel like someone was just out of sight. When I reached my car, I unlocked it and paused before getting inside, glancing one last time toward the ocean and then the sky. The clouds had shifted again, thicker now, covering most of the moon. I couldn't see that oval shape anywhere beyond the photo. As I slid into the driver's seat, my phone buzzed lightly. A notification from my friend Janelle asking if I'd made it home yet. I told her I was on my way. I started the car and the radio came on low, some late-night talk show mumbling in the background. As I pulled out, my headlights swept over the gravel and bushes near the edge of the lot. For a quick second, I thought I saw a darker patch near the brush, taller than the rest of the shadows, but when the beam moved fully over it, nothing stood there. The drive home felt longer than usual, even though the roads were empty and clear. Every time I glanced up at the sky through the windshield, I half expected to see something odd-shaped sitting behind the clouds again. When I finally parked outside my apartment building, the normalness of everything almost felt fake. The hallway light was on. Someone's TV glowed through a second-floor window. A stray cat darted across the sidewalk and vanished into the bushes. Inside, I tossed my jacket over the chair and sat on the edge of my bed, immediately reopening my photo gallery. The strange image was still there. The dark oval stood quietly among the moonlit clouds, untouched by anything else in the frame. I stared at it for a long minute before setting the phone down face up on my nightstand. Nothing else strange happened that night. No more lights outside. No sounds in the hallway, no buzzing, no movement. Just silence and the faint hum of my fridge. When I finally checked the sky again from my bedroom window, the clouds were thicker and the moon had almost disappeared behind them. The photo stayed on my phone exactly the same. I was halfway down Alderbrook Lane when the first porch light went dark. It had been on when I stepped out of Marcos's place, a soft yellow glow over his chipped concrete steps, and then it just clicked off. Not like a bulb burning out either. It was clean, instant. A second later, the next house did the same. Then the next. One by one, lights ahead of me shut off in a straight line, moving away like something was passing in front of them, even though the street looked empty. It was early evening, still a little blue in the sky, and the air felt heavy like it was going to rain, but hadn't decided yet. The kind of weather where everything felt quiet in a weird way. No birds, no cars, not even sprinklers running. I slowed down because it didn't make sense. That street was familiar, boring even. I'd walked it 100 times coming back from Marcos's place. Same low ranch houses, same trimmed hedges, same cracked sidewalk slabs. People usually kept their porch lights on automatically. Mrs. Ordonez at the corner left hers on so late it leaked into my bedroom window sometimes. That one went out too. I kept walking, mostly because standing still felt worse. Every few steps, another porch light snapped off ahead until I was moving into a darker pocket of the block. The houses behind me stayed lit. I glanced back, thinking maybe some power issue had hit just one side of the street, but everything behind was normal. About halfway down the block, I noticed movement beyond the yards. There was a narrow line of old trees separating our subdivision from the overgrown field that used to be a small golf course before it shut down. The grass back there was tall and uneven, and the trees had grown wild over the years, branches twisting over each other. Something moved just past that tree line. It wasn't fast or sudden, more like a slow shift, like when someone tries not to be seen. I squinted but couldn't make out anything clear. Just a dim shape, darker than the rest of the shadows, sliding behind the trunks. I told myself it was probably a deer or someone cutting through the field, but the way it moved didn't quite match that. It seemed taller, too upright. I kept my eyes forward and tried to act normal, even though my shoulders felt weirdly tight. Another porch light died as I passed, the house going dark the second I stepped in front of it, like I'd crossed some invisible line. A faint sound came from the trees. Not a voice. Not quite a rustle either. It was low and dragged out, like something brushing against dry leaves, but slower, more careful. When I turned my head again, the shape was still there, just a little farther along, keeping pace with me. I picked up my speed without fully committing to running. My mind kept trying to explain it. Maybe it was some guy from the nearby complex walking his dog off leash. Maybe kids messing around. Maybe my eyes were just playing tricks on me because the light was fading and my brains hated low contrast. Still, every time I passed another house, its porch light shut off. Not flickering, not dimming, just gone. I reached the part of the street where the sidewalk dipped slightly and the trees crowded closer to the yards. The dim shape drifted closer to the edge of the tree line. For a split second, I thought I saw a curve where a shoulder might be, or maybe just another trunk. The sound happened again, closer this time. A slow scraping noise like wet fabric dragging over bark. I muttered nope under my breath and finally started walking faster. My heart wasn't racing yet, but it felt like it was waiting to. Braced. Every sense felt turned up too high. I kept expecting someone to call out, but nothing did. When I glanced back again, 2 porch lights behind me shut off now too. Not following me like before. Just darkness spreading outward like a quiet wave. I hit the last third of the block, and that was when the streetlights flickered. Not fully out, just enough to make shadows stretch and shrink across the pavement. The shape of the tree line shifted again, closer than it had been, and for the first time I got the clear sense it wasn't interested in the houses. It was tracking me. My mouth felt dry. I checked my phone without fully looking away, pretending casual, but there was no signal bar change or alert. Just normal. Another sound drifted from the trees. This one was almost like breathing, but off. Too steady. Too deep. I kept walking, staring straight ahead, counting house numbers in my head like that could anchor me to something normal. When I passed number 814, the porch light didn't turn off. Instead, it brightened. Just a little, like someone had turned the dimmer up. The light behind the curtains inside that house also shifted, like someone was moving around. That house belonged to an older guy named Lennox, who mostly kept to himself. I'd only seen him once at the mailbox. As I stepped past his driveway, the brightened lights suddenly snapped off all the way, and for a full second, the whole block seemed darker than it should have been. I heard footsteps then. Not on the sidewalk. In the grass near the trees. Slow, deliberate steps. I didn't look. My skin felt like it had tightened over my bones. I just kept moving, pretending I hadn't noticed a thing, even while every part of me strained to sense how close it was. The footsteps stayed even with mine. When I reached the corner and turned toward my street, the shape finally stopped moving. I glanced sideways just once, as casually as I could manage. It stood just within the tree line now. Still hard to define. No face, no clear limbs, just an outline against the dim sky that looked wrong somehow, like it didn't belong to anything I'd ever seen stand that way before. None of the porch lights turned off on my street. I walked the rest of the way home without looking back again. The street stayed quiet. Normal. Porch lights. Steady. A dog barked somewhere. A car passed at the far intersection. When I locked my front door behind me, my hands were shaking more than I wanted to admit. I stood there listening, waiting for some sign through the windows, but nothing happened. Later, when I looked out from my bedroom window, the trees along Alderbrook Lane were still and dark. Every porch light had come back on like nothing strange had happened at all. Except one near the middle of the block was still off. My windshield fogged over so suddenly, I thought something had spilled on the glass. I hadn't even turned the defroster off. The air inside the car felt normal, not humid, not warm, just cold enough to make me keep my hands tucked in my sleeves. I was driving along Route 26 through the edge of the Ochoco National Forest, the kind of stretch where the road dipped and curved and there weren't any lights for miles. It was late afternoon and the sky was heavy with low gray clouds that threatened snow but never quite delivered. I reached for the cloth I kept in the console and wiped the glass with the side of my hand. It cleared for a second, then clouded again as if someone had breathed directly onto it from the outside. That didn't make sense. The windows were closed. No heat blasting. Just the regular low fan. I muttered to myself and finally turned the defroster up higher. The fog thinned in slow streaks, leaving blurry patches instead of full white haze. As I leaned forward to peer through it, I noticed a faint glow passing across the upper part of the windshield. At first, it looked like reflected sunlight, but the sun had already sunk behind the ridge to my right. This light was pale, almost milk-colored, drifting smoothly across the fogged glass as if something above my car were moving from one side to the other. I tilted my head, trying to see past the haze. The light didn't flicker or pulse, it just slid, steady and quiet, and disappeared somewhere beyond the roof. My first thought was a helicopter, but there was no sound, no thump of blades, no engine hum, just the low hiss of tires on damp pavement and the soft rush of the fan. The road ahead had grown darker, the trees crowded closer to the shoulders, their tops leaning inward like a tunnel. My car clock read 4:38 p.m. I'd left Prineville after a late shift at the hardware store because my coworker Raul begged me to swap hours. I'd planned to be home before dark, but the overcast sky made everything feel later than it was. The fog on the windshield refused to fully clear, so I pulled over at the next narrow turnout. Gravel crunched under the tires as I cut the engine. The silence felt heavier once the car stopped, like the forest absorbed all sound. I wiped the windshield with the sleeve of my jacket and stepped out. Cold air bit through the thin fabric immediately. My breath puffed out in small white clouds. I stared up at the sky, expecting to see whatever had caused that light. There was nothing, just thick gray cloud cover moving slowly east and the faint outline of treetops swaying in the breeze. No moving shape, no glow, no trail. I stood there for a few seconds too long, scanning the sky like it might suddenly reveal something if I looked hard enough. The longer I waited, the more wrong the silence felt. Not peaceful, just empty. I got back into the car and started driving again. The fog returned, not as heavy as before, but still enough to warp everything just slightly. The defroster kept cycling warm air across the glass, and the faint smell of dust rose from the vents. A few minutes later, the light appeared again. This time it moved slower. It crept along the top edge of the windshield, so dim it barely stood out against the fog, but it was there. A pale shape drifting overhead as if following the road. I tried glancing up through the roofline, craning my neck, but the position of the light never made sense with any normal angle. It didn't cast a beam. It didn't reflect off the hood. It just hovered in that narrow visual space between sky and glass. I whispered, "Okay," without really meaning to. The temperature inside the car felt like it dropped, even though the heater was still running. My skin felt tight, like cold air had pressed closer to me without touching. Then the radio cut out. Not static, not fade, just silence. The display still showed the station, but no sound came through. I clicked the volume up and down. Nothing. The light above me slid backwards slightly, then held steady. It stayed just out of view, like it didn't want to fully reveal itself. I hit the accelerator instinctively, pushing the speed up a little even though the road curves made it a bad idea. My headlights swept across wet asphalt and dark tree trunks. The forest felt closer, like it leaned in. A soft tapping sound came from the roof. Not rain. Too slow. Too deliberate. One tap, then another, spaced a few seconds apart. I tightened my grip on the wheel and kept my eyes locked on the broken yellow lines splitting the road. The fog on the windshield swirled slightly, patterns shifting in uneven streaks where my breathing hit the glass. The tapping stopped. The pale light drifted forward again and vanished. The windshield cleared a few seconds later like nothing had happened at all. The radio flicked back on mid-sentence, some guy talking about highway conditions and elk crossing warnings. My hands stayed frozen on the steering wheel until the muscles started to ache. I drove the rest of the stretch in silence anyway. When I reached the outskirts of town, the normal world crept back in bit by bit. A passing pickup truck, a mile marker sign, a small ranch driveway with a porch light glowing yellow. Everything felt painfully ordinary, like the road itself had decided to forget whatever just happened. Still, the back of my neck kept buzzing with the sense that something lingered nearby. watching quietly, but not aggressively, just observing. I pulled into the gravel lot beside my small rental house on the outskirts of Mitchell. The porch light was on. My dog Juniper barked once through the door before going quiet, like she'd recognized the sound of my car but didn't quite trust it. As I shut the engine off, the windshield fogged again, but only for a brief moment. I watched it carefully this time. No light moved across it. I stepped out, boots crunching on gravel, and glanced up at the sky out of habit. The clouds had thinned into uneven patches, and the faint edge of the moon glowed behind them. Nothing out of place, just clouds, just cold air. Inside, Juniper pressed against my legs like she always did, tail moving slow and anxious. I scratched behind her ears and waited for my breathing to settle. Later that night, after the heater hummed steadily and the house had gone quiet, I stepped onto my back porch and looked out toward the tree line beyond the yard. The snow clouds had finally started to roll in, soft flakes falling under the porch light. Everything felt normal again. But when I glanced toward my car, parked under the bare maple tree, there was still a faint haze across the windshield, even though the air was dry and cold. No light passed over it, just a quiet, pale film that hadn't been there before. The windows started rattling like a heavy truck was idling right outside my house. It wasn't the sharp clatter you get from wind. It was slower, almost a soft vibration that made the glass buzz gently in its frame, the kind of sound you feel more than hear. At first I thought a neighbor was running some loud equipment again, maybe Darlene Whitaker trying to clear brush down the road, but it was almost 10 at night and nobody around here worked that late. I stood in my kitchen holding a half-drunk mug of coffee, listening. The cabinets hummed faintly too, like the whole structure of the house was responding to something deep and low outside. The weird thing was, the air inside felt normal. No tremor under my feet, just the windows reacting. I walked to the front door and pressed my fingers lightly against the glass. The vibration traveled through my skin. When I leaned my ear close, it sounded like a distant engine that never shifted gears. I stepped onto the porch and the sound cut off instantly. Not faded, not weakened, just gone. The night felt wrong without it, too quiet. No crickets, no dogs barking, not even the usual hum from the highway a few miles off. The air felt thick, almost padded, and strangely still. No breeze, no movement in the trees. I stood there a minute trying to pinpoint anything. The sky looked clear but hazy, like the moonlight was bleeding faintly into the clouds. The yard sat unchanged, just my crooked fence, overgrown grass, and the old shed near the back that I never bothered to fix. When I turned back toward the house and opened the door, the vibration started again the second I stepped inside. The windows rattled once more. The low buzz filled the space. I stared at the glass, feeling my pulse pick up slightly. I shut the door and locked it, even though that made no sense. The sound continued, steady and patient. I tried turning on the TV to drown it out, but the noise felt like it came from somewhere deeper than the air itself. It wasn't loud, just present. After a minute or two, it slowly weakened. Not stopping, but thinning like something moving farther away. Then silence settled again. I stood there longer than I meant to, just listening to the quiet house, waiting for it to return. It didn't. I told myself it was probably some distant machinery or maybe a passing train in the valley, but my gut didn't buy that. The way it stopped outside like it never existed stayed with me. I finally went to bed, though sleep came slow. Every little creak made me think it was starting up again. Sometime after midnight, the vibration returned. This time it was stronger. The bedroom window rattled faintly against its track. My phone shifted slightly on the nightstand like the wood beneath it was breathing. I sat up and watched the curtains tremble. I slid out of bed and padded toward the back door. The closer I got, the more intense it became, yet somehow it never felt aggressive. Just focused. I opened the door and stepped into the backyard. Again, instant silence. That same unnatural stillness hung in the air. My breath felt too loud. The grass didn't move. The tree branches held completely still like a paused frame. And then I noticed the light. It wasn't bright, it wasn't sharp, just a washed-out pale glow hanging beyond my fence line, low over the open field behind my property. It hovered there like a dim reflection off fog that wasn't visible. It didn't behave like a flashlight or a car headlight. It had no source, no cone, no direction, just a soft floating presence. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. My eyes adjusted, but it never gained definition, just that faint shape suspended in the distance. The air felt heavier near it, not colder, just denser. I whispered hello without realizing it, then immediately felt ridiculous for it. The light didn't react. No sound came from it, no hum, no crackle, just the absence of the vibration that had filled the house moments before. I took a single step closer to the fence. The grass under my foot made a loud crunch that echoed unnaturally. The light shifted slightly, sliding sideways a gradual inch or two. My heart started beating faster. Not panicked, just alert. Behind me, my porch light flickered once. I didn't turn around. I stayed staring at the dim glow in the field. It felt aware of me, though I couldn't explain what that even meant. The longer I watched it, the more the sense of being observed grew. Then, slowly, it drifted farther back. Not up, not down, just gliding away into the dark. The vibration never returned while I stood there. I finally backed toward the house and stepped inside, locking the door again without looking away until I couldn't see the field through the window. Inside, the silence felt wrong now, almost louder than the sound had been. I checked the windows from the hallway. No rattling, no humming, just normal glass. I sat at the edge of my bed for a long time, staring at the bedroom wall, trying to breathe evenly. Sometime later, I realized my phone had no signal bars. No service at all. I hadn't noticed when it cut out. By morning, everything looked normal again. Birds sang, breeze moved the trees. The yard looked ordinary and tired like always. When Darlene's truck rolled past, I felt oddly relieved by the familiar engine noise. I checked the field behind the fence. No marks, no disturbed grass, nothing. But when I sat at my kitchen table later, drinking my now cold coffee, the windows gave a single faint rattle, just once. And then the air went still again. The notification from my security app showed up at 4:02 a.m., a low chime that pulled me out of a half-dream. I rolled over and grabbed my phone, squinting at the screen. It said there'd been motion in my backyard. That wasn't normal. I lived on a quiet street in Prairieville, one of those newer subdivisions where everything looked the same and nobody walked around at that hour. My name's Caleb DuPont, and I worked maintenance at a pharmacy warehouse. So I was used to weird schedules, but my yard staying still overnight was kind of a given. I opened the clip. The yard looked the same as always, the patchy grass, the old sagging oak at the back, my rusted grill off to the side. Then about 3 seconds in, the whole area washed out in a soft white flash, like someone shined a light just above the camera, not at it. It wasn't harsh, more like everything briefly turned pale and dull. After that, the image returned to normal. Nothing else moved. But right below the video, the timestamp jumped. It went from 4:02:11 to 4:4:13. No transition, no buffering, just 2 missing minutes. I watched it again, slower this time. Still nothing. No figures, no animals, no shadows crossing the yard. Just that gentle flash and then a small chunk of time that didn't exist. I checked the front camera next. Same thing. At 4:02 a.m., a faint brightening, then a skip forward. The side camera didn't capture it, though. That one just showed empty yard and wet pavement like always. I set the phone down and listened to the house. Everything was quiet except my old fridge cycling in the kitchen. My dog, Porter, stirred slightly at the foot of the bed, but didn't bark, didn't rise, didn't react. I pulled the blanket back and padded to the window anyway. Outside looked the same. The sprinklers across the street clicked softly. A thin mist hung in the air, the glow of streetlights blurring through it. No sign of anything unusual. Still, that missing time bothered me. I stayed awake until my alarm went off at 6 and dragged through my shift, replaying the clip over and over in my head. Around mid-morning, I showed it to my coworker, Simone, on break. "That's probably just a glitch," she said, sipping her soda. "These systems lag all the time." "Yeah," I said, but her answer didn't stick. When I got home in the afternoon, I checked the cameras again. Everything looked normal, but the logs still showed that 2-minute gap like it had been cleanly cut out. That night, I kept half an eye on the app while watching TV. Porter kept pacing near the back door more than usual, sniffing at the seams like he'd caught a random scent and couldn't pin it down. Around 11:30, the motion alert pinged again. This time, no flash. Just the yard looking slightly brighter than it should have, like the air held a pale haze. But nothing moved. I waited. The feed continued streaming, but the brightness stayed off for a good 30 seconds before slowly drifting back to normal. The timestamp didn't jump. Sleep came late and light. At exactly 4:02 the next morning, the alert hit again. My fingers tightened around the phone before I even opened it. Another soft flash. Same exact camera angle, same quiet frame. Then the timestamp skipped forward. 2 minutes gone. I sat up in bed and listened. No sound outside, no wind, no cars passing, just stillness, thick and empty. Porter lifted his head this time, ears twitching, but he didn't bark. He just stared toward the back door, eyes wide and unsettled. "Hey, boy," I muttered. He didn't move. I told myself I wasn't going out there, not at 4 in the morning, not for something that could be explained by faulty hardware. But that strange brightness stuck with me, so I pulled on a hoodie, slid my feet into sneakers, and stepped onto the back porch. The night air felt unnaturally heavy, like the humidity had piled up instead of drifting through. The trees behind my fence stood completely still. Not even a leaf moved. I turned on the porch light and stepped off the concrete, grass damp beneath my shoes. I glanced around the yard, trying to spot anything the camera might have missed. Nothing stood out. Still, I walked slowly toward the spot right below where the camera pointed, that faint chill crawling up my spine with every step. The ground didn't crunch or shift like usual, almost like the top layer had settled more than normal. I knelt and pressed my hand into the grass. It felt slightly cool, almost damp, but not muddy. Just flat. Behind me, the porch light dimmed slightly, then returned to normal. I froze. The yard stayed silent. No crickets, no distant traffic. Just the dull, quiet pressing in. When I straightened up and turned around, the back of the house looked exactly the same. The sliding door reflected faint white from the porch bulb. The shadows sat where they should. I backed up slowly and returned inside, locking the door behind me. Porter followed close at my heels like he needed to know I still existed. The next few nights passed the same way. Each time, 4:02 a.m., brought a soft wash of light across the yard that no visible source created. Each time, the timestamp skipped exactly 2 minutes. Nothing ever appeared on screen. No silhouettes, no movement, just time stepping aside. On the fourth night, I noticed something else. The security system didn't log my door sensor opening when I stepped out that first time. There was no record I'd been outside at all. I scrolled through the log twice to make sure. The system showed all normal activity until 3:58 a.m., then nothing until I left for work the next morning. No motion registered when I crossed the yard. No door sensor change. No history of me being out there. That made my stomach tighten more than the flash ever had. That evening, a light drizzle rolled in, the kind that clung to everything and smelled faintly metallic. Streetlights blurred into soft halos. I sat on the couch and watched the camera feed live for a long while, like if I stared long enough, I'd finally catch whatever was causing this. Nothing happened. But a little after 4 a.m., while the rain tapped softly on the roof, the feed brightened again. Gentle, silent, almost polite. Then, right before the timestamp jumped, the bottom corner of the screen showed the faintest ripple across the lawn, like air bending slightly just for a moment, and then the missing 2 minutes. I didn't go outside this time. When morning came, everything sat the same. Grass looked normal, fence straight, no marks, no burn patches, no disturbed soil. Only the log said anything odd had ever happened there. A week passed, the flashes stopped. The timestamps returned to normal. Motion alerts only showed the occasional stray cat or wind-blown branch. The quiet settled back into something familiar. But every now and then, when I checked the footage just out of habit, my finger would hover over those old recordings from 4:02 a.m. The light remained the same in each clip. Soft, brief, empty, and the 2 minutes stayed missing. Eli said something was hovering above the treetops, and I laughed because I thought he was messing with me. We'd been camping off Cottonwood Pass, not far from a narrow trail that barely showed up on the park map. It was early morning, just past 6, and the air had that cool, damp feel, like the ground hadn't fully woken up yet. A thin layer of fog sat low between the trees, and the smell of wet pine hung heavy around the tent. We'd only come out for one night, Nothing serious, just two friends trying to get away from phones and grocery lists and people. Eli had stepped out first to pee and stretch his legs. I was still half inside my sleeping bag when he said it. "Derek, there's something up there," he said, voice low but not joking. I zipped the tent flap open and leaned out, squinting into the gray light. "A bird?" He shook his head, still staring upward. "No, it's not moving right." I followed his gaze. The treetops swayed faintly in the breeze, long branches brushing against one another. Above them, the sky was the pale, washed-out color of early morning. For a second, I saw nothing strange at all. Then I noticed a faint glow, like a dull spot in the sky, barely brighter than the fog itself. It wasn't sharp, just a pale shape, suspended somewhere above the trees. "Is that the sun?" I muttered. "It's not in the right place," he said, "and it shouldn't be that low." We both stood there, feet sinking slightly into the soft ground, watching the glow hang in place. It didn't flicker. It didn't beam down light. It just hovered, quiet and steady. Then, slowly, it faded. Not like someone turning something off, more like the light was breathing out. It softened, thinned, and then it simply wasn't there anymore. The sky looked normal again. We stood in silence for a few seconds too long. "Probably fog doing weird stuff," I said, even though my stomach felt tight. "Yeah," he replied, but he sounded unsure. We tried to go back to normal after that. Heated up some instant coffee on the little stove, sat on the damp ground, and talked about whether the forecast actually called for rain or if we just guessed wrong. The fog stayed thick, but nothing else strange happened. Birds started up their usual noise, and the forest slowly filled with life again. Still, I kept looking up. A little later, as we were packing up the tent, my phone buzzed. No service, but the screen lit anyway, probably trying and failing to connect. I shoved it back into my pocket and felt that weird, tight feeling settle again. We decided to hike a short loop before heading back. The trail curved through dense trees and uneven ground, the kind of path where every step felt slightly off balance. Eli walked a few feet ahead most of the time, occasionally brushing branches aside. About 20 minutes in, he stopped again. "You feel that?" he asked. "Feel what?" "Like the air just got, I don't know, thicker." I paused and honestly couldn't tell if he was projecting or if something had actually changed. The breeze had quieted, the leaves barely moved. Then I realized it wasn't silent. There was a low tone barely above hearing level. Not like a bug, not wind, just a steady, faint hum that felt more like vibration than noise. "You hear that?" I asked now. "Yeah," he said, eyes scanning the trees. I thought it was just me. The hum lasted maybe 20 seconds, then slowly dropped away until it wasn't there anymore. Nothing else happened for another half hour. The normal world came back bit by bit. Crunch under boots, the smell of dirt, distant bird calls. We joked it off weekly, but neither of us stopped looking around. By the time we returned to the campsite, the fog had lifted higher, clinging only to the lower ground like thin smoke. The sun had broken through weekly, turning everything pale and muted. But something didn't feel the same. Near the edge of our sight, the ground looked slightly different. Not torn up, not damaged. Just flatter, like the grass had been pressed down evenly in a wide circular shape. "You see that?" Eli asked. I nodded. "We didn't do that, right?" "No, we didn't walk over there." We crouched near the edge, fingers hovering above the flattened patch. The ground felt slightly cool, even though the rest of the clearing had started warming up. "Probably just animals," I muttered. "Yeah," he agreed, but neither of us really believed it. We finished packing fast without saying much and started the walk back to the car. The path felt longer on the way out. Every snap of twig made me glance over my shoulder. At one point, I swore I saw a brief flicker of light between the trees behind us, but when I stopped and looked fully, there was nothing. Eli kept walking, but slower now. We finally reached the parking turnout, our dusty old Subaru sitting exactly where we left it. Seeing it felt weirdly comforting. As we threw our backpacks into the trunk, Eli quietly said, "You don't think anyone else saw that up there, right?" "I doubt it," I replied. "Probably just some weird reflection thing." He didn't respond. The drive back down the mountain passed like normal. Radio crackled. Gravel popped under the tires. The sky returned to its usual washed-out blue. But every now and then, when we passed open stretches where the trees thinned out, I caught myself glancing upward, just checking. Nothing appeared again. We split ways in the late afternoon, waved casually like it was any other trip. I drove the rest of the way home alone, windows slightly down, warm air brushing my face. When I pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine, the world felt ordinary again. My neighbor's dog barked. Someone's sprinkler ticked rhythmically a few houses over. Inside, I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the couch, letting the quiet settle around me. My phone finally grabbed a signal, and messages poured in like nothing had happened. Before I showered, I looked out my living room window once more at the pale evening sky above the rooftops. No strange shapes, no hovering glow, just soft clouds and the dull color of a normal day ending. But when I closed the blinds, a faint memory of that pale shape above the tree line stayed just behind my eyes, like something I almost saw clearly but never quite did. I noticed the star when I went out onto the roof to cool off because the inside of the house still felt like an oven. It had been one of those late summer days in western Kansas where the heat never really dropped, not even after the sun dipped below the neighbor's wheat silo. My name's Holden Mercer, and I lived alone in a small rental on the edge of haze, the kind of place where you could see clear to the horizon if you climbed high enough. I kept an old folding chair and a dusty battery fan up there, just to get some breeze that didn't smell like drywall. I sat back and stared at the sky, letting sweat dry on my skin, when I noticed one star sitting brighter than the rest. It wasn't the brightest, just oddly steady. I stared at it without really thinking, the way you do when your mind goes blank. A few minutes passed and I realized something felt off. That star hadn't moved. Everything else drifted slowly, the whole sky shifting almost too subtle to see unless you focused. That one point just stayed locked in place, like it didn't belong to the same pattern as everything else. I checked my phone for the time. 9:42 p.m. I tilted my head, squinting. It wasn't blinking, it wasn't fading. Just sitting there, perfectly still. I tried to convince myself maybe I was just tired or overheated, but the fan hummed faintly beside me, and the breeze brushed against my face, cool enough to keep me alert. I watched it longer, 5 minutes, then 10. It still didn't move. A strange, tight feeling crept behind my ribs. It wasn't panic, more like waiting for something that refused to announce itself. I leaned forward, elbows resting on my knees, eyes locked on that stationary point. A faint noise drifted from somewhere down the block. Not a voice, not a car, just a soft, distant hum that came and went without pattern. I glanced around at the quiet neighborhood. Porch lights glowed, a dog barked once and then stopped. Someone's TV flickered blue through a living room window. Everything else felt normal. I looked back up. The star hadn't shifted. After what felt like forever, it slid sideways. Just slightly at first. So slow it almost felt imagined. But then it kept going, drifting smoothly left without changing brightness or size. No trail, no flickering. Just sideways motion like it had been sitting on invisible rails. My throat went dry. I whispered, "What the hell?" into the night air. The star continued moving until it reached a darker stretch of sky near the fringe of low clouds. Then, with no warning, it vanished completely. Not faded, just gone. I sat there frozen, staring at the empty stretch it used to occupy. The rest of the sky stayed normal, constellations unchanged, small dots drifting slowly as expected. Only that one had behaved differently. The quiet felt heavier after that. I climbed down from the roof and went inside, mostly to shake the feeling that something had shifted. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the kitchen counter, listening to the house settle. A few minutes later, the hallway light flickered once and stabilized. Probably old wiring, I told myself. Still, my skin felt tight. I went back outside, though this time I stayed on the porch instead of climbing back up. The sky looked exactly as it should. No strange stationary points, no drifting glows, just the same wide Kansas night. A soft breeze crept along the ground, brushing my ankles like someone passing by too close. Then I heard it, low, distant. A faint vibration that almost felt more in my chest than my ears. It came from above, but not directly overhead, just somewhere high, spread thin. The sound lasted a few seconds, then faded into nothing. No planes passed, no headlights showed on the highway, just static quiet again. I stared up harder, trying to spot any other points acting strange, but the stars kept their normal slow motion. Everything behaved right. Still, the uneasy feeling refused to leave. I went back inside and forced myself onto the couch, flicking on some late night reruns just to have normal noise nearby. My dog, Marla, hopped up next to me and pressed her warm side against my leg, tail moving slow but steady. That helped a little. About an hour later, I checked the time again, 10:58 p.m. I stepped into the backyard, curiosity getting the better of me. The air felt cooler now, less sticky. The wheat fields behind my fence whispered faintly in the soft breeze. I tilted my head back once more. At first, the sky looked normal. Then I spotted another star that felt too still. This one wasn't the same spot as before. This one sat lower, closer to the horizon line where the fields stretched into darkness. It held steady the same way, almost defiant against the slow movement of the rest of the sky. I felt something deep and quiet tighten in my chest. I watched it. It stayed perfectly fixed. No blinking, no change in color, just that same stubborn point against the wide night. I waited. The minutes crept by. Marla whined softly behind me, but I didn't turn around. Then that star moved too, sideways again. Smooth, patient, like it had only been paused, not placed there. As it slid, a faint glow spread briefly around it, barely noticeable unless you stared directly. Then it slipped behind a thin cloud and disappeared for good. The sky returned to its ordinary scattered pattern. Nothing followed. No sound. No light. No tremor. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting for some kind of repeat or signal that I wasn't imagining things. But the night behaved like any other. Eventually, I went back inside, locked the door, and sat beside Marla until my breathing slowed back down. When I finally crawled into bed and peeked out the window one last time, the stars moved exactly as they always had. But the stillness I'd seen lingered somewhere behind my eyes, like the sky had briefly paused for something I wasn't meant to notice, and then continued on as if it had never happened at all. The night went quiet in a way that didn't make sense somewhere around the third block. I'd left Theo's apartment a little after midnight, pulling my jacket tighter as I headed down Delancey toward my place on the edge of River Point. It had been muggy all day, the kind of late September humidity that stuck to your skin even after the sun dropped. A light mist hung in the air, not quite rain, just enough to make the street lamps blur softly around their edges. At first, everything felt normal. Distant traffic, a siren way off somewhere near the interstate, someone laughing outside a bar a few streets over, the usual city noise that never fully shut off. Then, halfway past the old dry cleaner and the closed nail salon, the sound just thinned. It didn't stop completely. It just dulled, like someone had pressed a layer of cotton over the entire block. Footsteps still echoed, but softer than they should have been. The hum of traffic faded until it sounded like it was miles away instead of just a few roads over. I slowed down, glancing around. Streetlights stayed on. A cat darted across an alley. The mist swirled low near the curb. Everything looked the same, but the world felt muffled. I clapped my hands once out of instinct. The sound came out strangely flat, like the air swallowed it halfway. Okay, I muttered, trying to sound normal even though my stomach tightened. I kept walking. That's when I noticed the hum. It came from above, somewhere high and vague, not directional. Just a low, steady vibration that felt like it lived in the air itself. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp. It just followed, matching the rhythm of my steps without any obvious source. I looked up at the overcast sky. I didn't see anything. Just pale clouds glowing dull orange from the city lights. The hum stayed with me. I passed the boarded-up hardware store and the chain-link fence that bordered the old rail spur, and the sound didn't shift. It didn't grow louder or quieter. It just remained, barely noticeable, unless I paid attention, which, of course, I was now doing. I told myself it was probably some nearby transformer or distant construction noise bouncing weirdly off the humidity. That explanation didn't fully land, but it was the only one I had. Another block went by. The muted silence held. No car passed, no voices drifted from open windows. Even the wind felt paused. A bead of sweat rolled down my neck despite the cooler night air. I glanced back over my shoulder. The street behind looked empty and normal, lit by the same hazy lamps, but even the faint clatter of loose trash blowing along the curb had vanished. The hum continued. My phone buzzed softly in my pocket, and the vibration felt too sharp in the quiet, like it cut through the thick air. I pulled it out without slowing. A text from Mira asking if I'd made it home yet. Almost, I typed, then stuck the phone back away. The moment my hand left my pocket, the hum deepened slightly. Not louder, just closer. My pace picked up without me thinking about it. The muffled world didn't change. It still felt like the city's volume had been turned down a notch and left there deliberately. Halfway down the next block, I noticed something else. Streetlights ahead started to look dimmer, not flickering, just softer, like the mist had thickened directly under them, swallowing more light than before. The hum hovered somewhere above my head. I tilted my face up again. The clouds were low and slow moving. Nothing was visible that should have produced sound like that. No helicopters, no blimps, no planes, just heavy sky. My skin prickled. The silence stretched on, uncomfortable and heavy. I crossed the intersection near Larkin Street and felt that same strange pressure settle deeper into my chest, like the air was slightly compressing around me. I could still hear my own breathing, but even that sounded distant. The hum followed me through the intersection. I glanced up at the windows of the apartment building to my left. Most were dark. One glowed faintly blue from a TV. No one else stood outside. No cars rolled past. It felt like the entire block belonged only to me and whatever that sound came from. "Come on," I muttered, trying to shake the nervous edge creeping into my voice. That was when the hum briefly shifted. It dipped lower for just a second, almost dropping out completely, then rose again, slightly faster, like something adjusting its position above me. I stopped walking. The hum stayed. The city remained eerily muted. I forced myself to take a few more steps, and the moment I started moving again, the hum moved with me. Still overhead, still perfectly matched. No echo, no delay. Another sensation joined it then, subtle but unmistakable. The feeling of being watched. Not from behind, not from the sides. From somewhere above and just ahead, like an unseen point had locked onto me and refused to break focus. I didn't want to look up again, but my eyes went anyway. There was nothing there, just thick cloud cover and a faint pale smear of reflected light. The hum remained. I shortened my stride and quickened the pace, heading toward the part of the street where the city usually woke back up again with passing taxis and open late-night diners. I half expected normal noise to snap back into place like someone flipping a switch, but it didn't. Another block passed, then another. The quiet stayed wrong. My heartbeat started to feel louder in my ears than my own footsteps, and I kept resisting the urge to run because something about running felt like acknowledging the fear too openly. The hum pulsed faintly, like it was responding to my tension. Then, somewhere ahead, the soundscape shifted. Distant tires, a car engine, the faint chatter of voices, real city noise. I picked my head up sharply, scanning forward. I could see the intersection where the 24-hour ramen place glowed warm and yellow, steam fogging its windows. The hum wavered. For the first time, it drifted slightly out of rhythm with me. I stepped faster. The muted feeling thinned with each step, like I was walking out of a bubble without noticing where its walls stood. Traffic noise crept back in. Street sounds regained their normal texture. Even the breeze picked up, rustling loose paper near the curb. The hum faded until it wasn't there anymore. I stopped right at the corner and listened hard. Nothing followed. Just the steady, familiar noise of River Point waking back into itself. I exhaled slowly, realizing how tense my shoulders had become. I walked the rest of the way home quickly, though, not enjoying the normal sounds as much as I usually would. When I reached my building and turned the key in the door, the solid click felt oddly grounding. Inside, my apartment looked the same. Same low lamp glow, same quiet hum of the fridge, same pile of shoes by the entry. I locked the door and leaned against it for a second, breathing out slowly. When I finally stepped toward the window and peeked through the blinds, the street below looked exactly as it always had. People passing, cars rolling, night noise alive again. No hum, no strange silence, just the city moving on. Still, the stretch of quiet followed behind my thoughts like an echo that never quite found its source, as if I'd walked through a place the rest of the world wasn't fully aware existed. The sound started while I was sitting on a flat rock with my shoes off, toes in the cold edge of the lake, just trying to relax after a long week. It was past 10, maybe closer to 11, and the whole shoreline was quiet, except for insects and the occasional splash from something farther out. There wasn't a breeze. The water looked like dark glass. Then I heard this soft mechanical noise above me. Not loud, not sudden, just a steady, low whirring, like something spinning slowly in the air. At first I figured it was a drone from someone's cabin across the water, but it didn't move like one. I tilted my head back and looked up. The stars above the lake were bright and clear, but right over the middle section, a perfectly round patch of darkness drifted across them. It wasn't a cloud. The edges were too clean. It was like someone had cut out a piece of the sky and slid something solid in front of it. The shadow moved slowly, steady, no wobble, no flicker, and the sound lined up with it perfectly. My name is Jonah Kellerman. I'd driven out to Lake Dorian that night because it was usually empty and calm. Just an old access road, a small dock, and a few dusty benches. I'd been here dozens of times before, never saw anything strange. It was always boring in the best way. I stood up slowly, gravel crunching under my heel, and kept my eyes on that strange round break in the stars. The mechanical sound stayed the same tone, like a distant motor running at the same speed. It didn't cast any light, just the faint absence of stars where it passed. I walked a few steps closer to the water, trying to see if I could make out anything reflective or shiny, but the surface stayed dark and calm. Hello? I didn't know why I said it, but the words slipped out anyway. No answer, just the soft whirring. The shape continued drifting overhead, crossing from left to right at a pace that felt way too controlled to be random. I watched it until it slipped behind the dark outline of the pine trees on the opposite shore and completely vanished. The sound faded a few seconds later, gradually, not suddenly. Silence rushed back in, louder than before. I stood there for a long while, scanning the sky like an idiot, waiting for it to come back. Nothing did. Just normal stars, normal night. I told myself it was probably some weird reflection or a trick of the clouds, even though that made no sense. After another minute, I forced myself to sit back down and try to shake it off. But the calm felt fake now. 10 minutes passed, then 15. I started hearing small sounds behind me on the tree line, not footsteps, more like something brushing through tall grass or low branches. I turned a couple times but didn't see anyone. The air felt heavier, still no wind. I checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising this far out, but the battery had somehow dropped from 70% to 40% since I'd gotten there. I didn't remember using it much. The mechanical sound came back. Softer this time, higher pitch, almost delicate. I looked up again, heart already racing, and saw the same perfect round shadow sliding slowly across the stars, but this time it was lower, closer to the treetops. The shape didn't change at all. No blinking lights, no visible structure, just a moving absence. I found myself stepping backward without really thinking, gravel crunching louder now. The sound hummed steadily above me. It felt close, too close. A ripple spread across the lake directly below the shadow, even though the water everywhere else stayed smooth. The ripple formed a clean circle, expanding slowly outward as if something invisible hovered right above it. I whispered, "What is that?" The shadow paused, not stopped entirely, just slowed almost to nothing, hanging right there over the middle of the water. The whirring shifted slightly, the pitch adjusting by a tiny fraction, like something recalibrating. My skin prickled all over my arms. I could feel my pulse in my throat. The night smelled different suddenly, faintly metallic, like cold coins. Then the shadow resumed moving, sliding further across the sky. It passed over the far shore and faded into nothing again. No dramatic exit, just gone. I waited, breathing shallow, afraid if I moved too quickly it would come back sharper or louder. When nothing happened for a few minutes, I finally forced myself to move toward my car, parked near the dirt road entrance. As I walked away, the sound started again behind me. This time, it didn't come from above. It came from somewhere behind the trees, lining the parking area. A low, steady, mechanical hum, closer than before, too close to ignore. I stopped and turned slowly. The trees were dark outlines, no movement visible between them. But the humming became more distinct, like metal slowly sliding past metal. I didn't see any light, no shadow this time. Just that sound. My instincts screamed to leave, but my body hesitated, frozen in place for a second too long. I forced my legs forward and headed to my car, each step heavy and wrong. When I reached the driver's door, the hum cut out completely. Then the night dropped into absolute silence again, way too perfect. I got inside fast, locked the doors without thinking, and started the engine. The dashboard lights flickered once, dimming slightly, then returned to normal. As I pulled onto the narrow dirt road, my headlights swept across the tree line. For the briefest second, something circular seemed darker among the branches, like a hole in the night itself. Then I blinked, and it was gone. The rest of the drive home felt unreal. The radio wouldn't tune properly, only static, so I shut it off. The woods along the road looked thicker than usual, shadows stretching in awkward angles. When I reached my apartment, I didn't even bother turning on the porch light right away. I just stood there for a second, staring up at the sky. Everything looked normal, stars unchanged, no moving round void, no sound. Inside, I locked the door, double-checked it, and sat on my couch, listening to my own breathing until it finally settled. Later, around 2 in the morning, I checked my car dash cam, half expecting to see something unusual. There was nothing dramatic, just the dark road, my headlights, a normal drive. Except at one point near the lake, the image warped slightly for about 3 seconds, as if something passed close enough to distort the air. The audio picked up a faint rhythmic hum, barely noticeable unless I listened carefully. By morning, the lake looked normal again when I passed it on my way to work. Still water, still quiet. But when night came, I didn't go anywhere near it. I stayed inside, curtains half drawn, occasionally glancing at the sky through the window. Every now and then, if the night got too quiet, I almost thought I could hear that faint mechanical tone again, humming somewhere far above, drifting patiently across the dark. I set up the trail camera because of the raccoon problem. That's it, nothing exciting. My neighbor Marcy said she'd seen at least 3 of them climbing over my fence every night, and I kept finding my trash can knocked over in the morning. I bought a cheap motion-triggered camera online, strapped it to the big oak in my backyard, and figured I'd get a week's worth of blurry raccoon photos and maybe a skunk or 2. That first night, the weather was weird. Warm for October, but with this heavy, wet feeling in the air, like it was going to storm even though the sky was clear. No wind, no bugs humming, just this thick quiet that made it feel later than it was. I went to bed around 11. Nothing special happened. No noises, no lights, no animals shrieking. I slept pretty deeply, actually. I didn't wake up until my alarm went off. The only strange thing I noticed that morning was that my porch light was off, even though it's on a timer. I checked the switch and it was still set correctly. I figured the bulb died, though I couldn't remember how old it was. It wasn't until after work that I remembered the camera. I expected maybe 20 photos, tops, maybe a raccoon waddling around or a neighborhood cat. Instead, when I plugged the SD card into my laptop, the first thing I saw was that the camera had taken 137 photos in one night. Most were exactly what you'd expect. Empty backyard, one shot of a possum, a couple of leaves close to the lens, my fence glowing in infrared. But then I scrolled down. Every shot between 2 and 2:03 a.m. was totally white. Not overexposed, not washed out by the flash, just white. A completely uniform blank image, like someone had opened Photoshop and filled the canvas with pure white. I thought the camera glitched, so I flipped through them quickly. White, white, white. 90 plus identical white frames. I checked the timestamps. The first white photo was 2:11. The last was 2:03:04. I stared at them long enough that my eyes started to hurt. The camera didn't usually fire more than once every 4 or 5 seconds because of the reset time, but these were spaced 1 to 2 seconds apart. Like something kept triggering it over and over, non-stop. I put the SD card back in the camera and took a test shot in my kitchen. The picture came out fine. I tried shining a flashlight directly into the lens. The result was still a normal photo, a bright flare in a dark frame, but not a blank white image. That's when I started feeling uneasy. I went outside to check the spot. The grass looked normal. The oak tree looked normal. Nothing burned, nothing flattened, no signs that anything had even stepped there. The camera mount was still tight. The settings were the same. I told myself maybe a spider built a web on the lens and the flash reflected off it. But when I ran my thumb over the lens, there was nothing there. No thread, no smudge, nothing sticky. The next night, I reset the camera and put it back in the same place. I woke up once around 1:45 a.m. for no real reason. My house was quiet, too quiet. I'm used to hearing the fridge or the pipes or something. This time there was nothing. The air felt as heavy as the night before. I eventually drifted off again. When I checked the photos later that day, the same thing had happened. 2:02 to 2:05 a.m. this time. Every picture in that window, pure white. I didn't like how consistent it was. Same narrow time frame, same type of blank image. And once again, the shots fired much faster than the camera usually allowed. That evening, I tried a little experiment. I went outside at 1:50 a.m. and sat in a chair near the tree. I didn't turn on any lights. I just sat there with a blanket around my shoulders, listening. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then, around 2 exactly, I noticed the air shift. Not wind, just a kind of pressure change, like when a storm rolls in. My ears popped. The tree leaves around me didn't move, the grass didn't sway, but the air felt heavier, thicker, like I was underwater. I didn't hear the camera take a picture. Usually the shutter makes a faint clicking sound. This time, it was silent, or maybe I couldn't hear it through that weird pressure feeling. Then something changed with the light. Not bright, not like a flashlight or car headlights, but the darkness around me got thin. That's the best word I have. The shadows softened. The area around the tree felt washed out, like someone had turned down the contrast on reality. I don't know how else to explain it. It lasted maybe 20 seconds. Then, as quickly as it came on, it stopped. Everything snapped back. The air felt normal. The shadows looked sharp again. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The photos the next morning were the same, white from 2 to 2:03 a.m. I tried moving the camera the following night. I strapped it to the fence instead, angled so it pointed toward the house. I wanted to see if the light was coming from outside the yard. That night, I stayed inside, watching from the kitchen window. I kept the room dark so I could see clearly into the yard. Around 2 a.m., the same muted shift happened. The air felt wrong again, thick and quiet. I watched the yard, waiting to see some actual light source or movement. Nothing. No glow, no figure, no animal. Just the same flattened, washed-out quality I'd felt when I'd been outside. The next batch of photos were blank again. I was starting to get nervous. Not panicked, just this persistent sense that something was coming into my yard, or around it, or through it, every night at the same time. Not an animal, not a neighbor's light, something else. On the 5th night, I took a different approach. I set up my old camcorder in the window, aimed at the yard. I left the trail camera on the fence too, figuring I'd compare the footage. At 1:57 a.m., I hit record on the camcorder and let it run. When the air pressure changed, I felt it from inside. My ears popped again. The room dimmed slightly, like a cloud passed in front of the moon, except there was no moon that night. The camcorder didn't pick up any obvious light. The image just got slightly flatter, like someone put a translucent sheet over the lens. The trail camera didn't click. I watched it. I should have heard something. But once again, nothing. The next morning, the SD card had 12 white photos, all between 2 and 2:02 a.m. The camcorder footage showed nothing but a slight haze during those minutes. I thought about telling someone, Marcy, or my brother Daniel, or even posting the photos online, but I knew what it would sound like. I barely understood it myself, and I didn't have anything concrete, just white pictures and some footage where the yard looked a little blurry. I left the camera up for another week. Every single night between 1:58 and 2:05, I got blank frames. The window of time shifted slightly but stayed centered around 2 a.m. On the 9th night, something new happened. I woke up at exactly 2:01 a.m. I didn't hear anything, but my eyes opened like someone had whispered my name. I sat up in bed and felt the pressure change immediately. My ears popped so hard it almost hurt. Then, a faint brightness seeped through my curtains. Not enough to cast shadows, just enough to lighten the room a shade. A soft, uniform glow. I got out of bed and walked to the window. I pulled the curtain back an inch. My backyard was white. Not bright, not glowing. Just white, like it was filled with fog, except the air wasn't moving and nothing swirled. It wasn't fog, it wasn't light. It was this flat, pale presence sitting over everything. The oak, the fence, the grass, all washed in the same blank color. I let the curtain fall back into place. The glow faded. The pressure lifted. My ears popped again, this time back to normal. I didn't check the trail camera until later that afternoon. I already knew what would be there. Pure white from 2 to 203. The camera still works. I still have it. I haven't put it up again since that night. I don't think I want to know whether it's still happening, but sometimes around 2 in the morning I'll wake up for no reason at all, and the house feels heavy and the air feels still, and I keep my eyes closed because I don't want to see whether the room has gone a shade too bright.